to that, but you need to work closely with your statisticians. Okay, budget. Don't under budget. List everything you think you might need. And you'd be surprised. I mean, people understand that doing good research is costly. So if you think you need it, put it in your budget. Make sure you know the funding rules. Some things they say, we will not fund X, don't put it in. But if you think you need it, make sure you put it in and justify it. Tell them why you need it. Don't under budget. Okay, so there's so many different reasons why your application may not be successful, but these are some of them. Confusing or non-responsive language. They will tell you right in the RFP what they're looking for. I sometimes parrot it right back to them. That's what they want. Try to make sure it's novel. Make sure it hasn't been done before. Specific games that can't stand alone. If it seems unfocused, if you don't have the right expertise or the right team, you're not going to have expertise in everything, but you need to find collaborators that do. If it's a certain methodology or a certain field, make sure you get enough collaborators that you have the expertise. Make sure the scope is not too big, and make sure you have a strong rationale. So that's a quick tour through that. There's so much more, but we'll have a lot of discussion at the end, hopefully, that we can delve into this more.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Watson, for succinctly summarizing pros and pitfalls for fundable research. Our next talk is Components of a Fundable Research Proposal, Differentiators, by Dr. Wang. And I believe this talk is recorded.
No.
It's live. Okay.
This is a live one. The recorded one is the funding opportunities one.
Sounds good. Dr. Wang?
So I'm going to take control here. There's going to be some overlap, as you can see, with Carol's. Carol's was talking about a lot of the fundamentals. There's some things that are repeated here, but I think they're probably repeated for a reason. They should be emphasized again and again. So let's see, how do I, there you go, my disclosures. So first of all, for those of you who are a bit down about grants because you might have recently gotten a grant rejected, it happens to the best of us. This is someone who won a Nobel Prize in 2009 on the same day she learned that her grant proposal was rejected. So again, this happens to the best of us. Keep your chin up. It's worth doing again and again. But getting started, these are some philosophical thoughts. You don't need to write many grants as long as you're writing the ones you're likely to get. Now that seems kind of like a silly statement, but it's really a reminder to folks, read the application instructions, even if they are 102 pages, because you want to know that the grant opportunity really fits what you're trying to do. If you write grants to things that don't fit, you're not going to get very much. Usually if you're applying for something, if you've got folks around who can share successful proposals to the same funding agency, I think that's something that's very helpful to know what the agency likes or doesn't like. Sit in on mock reviews at your own institution if you've got those. And you know, yesterday you heard Gail talk about it, grants officers and how open they are. You can always kind of do it what you call a soft pitch to a grants officer. Get their thoughts on this. The second thing, which I think you'll hear people say again and again and again, you need time to write the grant. The less time you spend writing the grant, the greater the chance you're going to miss the forest for the trees. And typically a recommendation is figure out how long your grant is and budget for a week per page, how far in advance you need to start. And remember, successful grants will often lead to more funding by the same agency, so you're going to get to know your project officer very, very well. Some other differentiators. The best grants have the most white space on them. And by that, I mean, if you've got a wall of text, as someone who, and some of you might have sat on grant review committees, that is just really hard to read. So you've got to have a good amount of white space on this. Spelling and grammatical errors, are just terrible. You can't do it because it really casts doubt on your research rigor. So the best, the well-differentiated grants are very well proofread. Don't go for lengthier multisyllabic jargon. It really doesn't do well. Clear, short, concise statements that get the message across is great. A lot of grants have keyword selections. This is sort of what triages the grant to a certain committee or review section. So pay attention to those. And remember, you're trying to tell a story that people will remember. If your story is kind of blah, no one's going to really remember it well enough to give you a good score. And the thing I didn't know the first time I wrote a grant was, use formatting effectively. You don't want to overdo these things, but you can bold, italicize, or underline key points throughout the grant. For some reason, that didn't come across my radar when I first started writing grants. I wanted to share that. Now, every section generally judges grants based on a few criteria. These are sort of the 5 cores that a lot of funding agencies use: significance, the investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. I think this is probably not that unfamiliar to many of you. I will go back to that oops, hold on. I need to run backwards. There you go. Thank you. If you're an early investigator, spend as much time on the career development plan as you do on the research plan, because this is a part that the reviewers are paying extra attention to, and you can get brownie points there, even if your research plan is not, rocket science. I think Carol spent a good amount of time on the specific aims. So a lot of this you've already heard. Kevin said this yesterday, Carol said it this morning. I'm going to say it one more time. Your later aim should be connected to, but not contingent on, your prior aim. If specific aim doesn't work out for you, but your aim 2 and 3 are dependent on aim 1 working out according to your hypothesis, your grant is dead in the water. So connected, but not contingent. Very, very, very important. And I usually like having a very sort of a diagram on the specific aims page that really displays your conceptual framework here. So something to think about there. Going backwards a little bit, thinking about the title is often something to think about as well. Keep it short and sweet. And remember, if you're applying to industry or foundational grants, someone asked this question on the chat yesterday, tips for these non-government grants. Your title doesn't have to be very academic. Academic titles tend to be those that are very precise and scientifically correct. Not that you don't want to be scientifically correct, but you could juice it up a little bit if you're applying to industry or foundational types of grants. Okay. Don't put typos in. As you can see, don't keep the reviewer in suspense. Don't do that. Okay. I'd like to say that that was deliberate just to demonstrate a point, but that wasn't. I'll admit that. But in your first paragraph, don't keep the reviewer in suspense. Tell them what you're planning to do. Okay. Think of the grant as more of a job interview than a journal article. It's okay to think big, but don't overreach. Don't use language like, this project will revolutionize the field, or we will shift the paradigm, or with this tiny little grant, I am going to do major grand things that require a lot more money. These kind of things are sort of red flags for a grant reviewer. Claim innovation only if you really are truly innovative. So how is it different? And then remember, this is why you're looking at the FOA or the PA or whatever the grant criteria are. You want to write specifically to what the grant is looking for. Consult a statistician often and early. And I think, again, a lot of this has been covered by Carol already. You've got to have a power calculation as part of this. Don't make this all text. Use tables and graphics. If you've got key variables, put them in a table. I like seeing limitations in the approach section because it tells me that you've been very thoughtful about it. And so, the differentiated grant really is already thinking about all of this, and it's also thinking about what this grant is going to lead to in the future here. So these are good sections, subheadings to put under the approach here. If this is one of your first grants, I mean, it's true for all of your grants, but your study team, your expertise is really important. And so sometimes I mentioned the career development plan part. You need to be very clear and detailed about what your mentorship plans are. And it even comes down to nitty-gritty things like how frequently you're going to meet, what's the timeline of what you're going to discuss. Do you have the co-investigators with the needed expertise, things that you don't have or things you need to require? Do you have courses that you need to do as part of that? Again, all of that needs to be detailed in this. The reviewers also want to make sure that you're not just spewing fluff here, that you're backing this up with a plan for how to make sure this happens. And usually that means you've got funded time or some other evidence that shows that your co-investigators will be engaged and will be doing that work with you. A lot of grant mechanisms nowadays also really like a patient or stakeholder type of input to what you're doing. But of course, this depends on the grant mechanism you're looking at. You're going to get biosketches from your supporting personnel. And each biosketch, as you know, has a personal statement. Now, generally what I do when I'm writing a grant is I actually send the person who's sending me their biosketch a little blurb to put in their personal statement, because what you don't want is sort of this personal statement that sounds so vague and not really tied to your project. Make it easier for your co-investigators to support you on this application. Same thing goes with letters of support. Don't leave this till the last minute. We are tempted to do that because it's often the last checkbox we need to do. But reviewers really hate overly general or disinterested letters. So help your folks out by giving them little blurbs to put in there as well. Your equipment and facilities description, every institution sometimes has sort of a template. Make sure you're looking at that and only limiting those to things that are relevant to your project plan. We don't like seeing a whole bunch of garbage in there as a reviewer. You will get rejections. There are many, many phases of emotions dealing with rejections. Hopefully, you're going to traverse through your denial, your anger, I'm not sure there's much bargaining, or the depression. Someone asked this question yesterday, when did I feel like this was something that I just needed to give up on my science career? Yeah, when you've been rejected get your third rejection on a grant and your sixth rejection from a journal on a manuscript in the same week, yeah, it's kind of a low point, but it's okay. You just get through it, get to the other side. Roxana says she's been rejected a zillion times. We've all been there, even Roxana. You submit the same proposal, be persistent, use a different title, use a smaller budget, use whatever you need to do. But get through this and be persistent. You've got to have a good amount of resilience in order to be to have a sustainable academic career. Hindsight. Grant writing is really sort of a self-inventory exercise. What are you passionate about? Where your strengths are? What are your capabilities? Where do you need complementary or new skills? What kind of team or mentor do you need? It's also a question to yourself, do I need to network more in order to be able to find partners? So this is really a marathon, not a sprint. And one of the best ways to really learn how to be a good proposal writer is to be a reviewer yourself. You notice that a lot of comments I made are from the perspective of the reviewer, because that's really helped me think about how to get better at grant writing. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in doing a little bit more in-depth work here, Javid and others are doing this ACC webinar on November 19th. You should sign up for it. It's on grant research and manuscript submission, so definitely hone your skills there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tracy, what a wonderful talk. I mean, really, truly the soup to nuts of what it means to write a grant, and of course, the rejections and the positives and the negatives. Thank you for that. We're going to move now to Michelle O'Donoghue. Who better to talk to us about presenting yourself as a capable research leader? Sending you our love, Michelle. You're amazing.
Thanks, Roxana. So I had actually, I'm not sure, am I supposed to be presenting this live? Because I know that they had pre-recorded it. So I'm sorry for the confusion moment here.
It's pre-recorded. We clarified that.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So if it's
I'm happy to present it again. But...
Hopefully people
Michelle,
have listened to it.
Just the summary slide.
Sure.
Yeah, if you could just put up your summary slide and just kind of start our discussion as we move into the panel discussion between you, Tracy, and Carol. You guys couldn't hear me. I was on the phone. I was in the cath lab. It was absolutely crazy. So, but I'm good now. Sorry about that. So let's, put up your, if we could put up your summary slide and then sort of start. And I often am asked as we start to kind of start this discussion is, what is the elevator talk? How do you do the elevator talk? And in what way do you prepare to present yourself in such a short, concise, succinct manner? You want to start with that, and then let's get back to some of the questions regarding grant funding and research proposals.
Sure. No, that sounds great. And actually, this is not my talk, I think, that I'm looking at on the slide. There we go. No, mine is very brief in terms of, what I was trying to summarize, for my discussion. And I think that Carol and Tracy nicely set the stage, because at the end of the day, I think that ultimately the path to research success really needs to be built on a strong foundation of original research, and getting your own grant funding is such an important part of that. But then I think beyond that there are opportunities to market yourself a little bit better, for lack of a better term. As Roxana was saying, the elevator talk, how can I put my best foot forward and make sure that not only am I doing the research, but people are actually recognizing me in the field. So a few of the concepts that I touched upon in my talk were just, one, I think, especially early in your career, trying to really declare a major. Try not to be too disparate in terms of your research interests, because the more that you can become an expert in one particular focused area, I think it really helps you, and it helps to get your name known. And that can be publishing. Obviously, if you have your own data to publish on a particular topic, that's perfect. But you can also become deeply involved with, trying to become an expert in other ways, whether it's, presenting abstracts certainly is wonderful, but also any of the expert talks that you might be able to deliver at ACC. Becoming involved with the emerging faculty at ACC is also very important, because the emerging faculty often get identified for some of these expert talks that they're trying to fill. And I also touched upon social media too. And I have to, I fully will admit that I'm not necessarily the world's best in terms of Twitter or anything like that, but I think that there are unique opportunities that have really helped to level the playing field, because it does give you an opportunity to get your name out there, but it has to be used the right way. And I think some of the questions about Twitter came up yesterday, and about use of social media. And ultimately, I think the feeling is that you really do have to have a strong foundation of original research. Being a Twitter star in and of itself is not going to be sufficient. It might get your name known, but it's not necessarily going to get you in any open doors for speaking opportunities, or getting you on, an LBCT panel, for instance. But nonetheless, I think that it does create unique opportunities that were not previously available. And I also mentioned, Roxana is doing such a wonderful job with Women as One, with trying to promote women's careers and in particular junior faculty. So I certainly would, encourage you to look at her elevator awards and things of the such that I think are helping to level the playing field as well. So maybe I'll just pause there. And
Michelle. No, this is wonderful. You did pre-record. We were. We didn't know that you were going to be able to join us. We're thrilled that you're here live. And of course, we will be releasing, Stephanie Mitchell just said, and so did Tracy, that this will be released to everyone, your talk, because I think those elements are so crucial, the parts that you're covering in your talk. And I couldn't underline more the importance of not getting famous on Twitter by being just a Twitter star, but that you are actually have some substance behind that. And I personally get upset about that, like deeply and viscerally upset about that. I think it's really, especially for those of us who have spent decades and decades of hard work and with real evidence and work. And this goes for men and women, but honestly, it is really important to know how to use social media to the best possible way that it can help you, and to make sure that you avoid confrontation on Twitter. It's never a good place to engage in confrontation. Healthy discussion, especially if it's about a clinical trial where you believe you have important insight that might have been missed, is different than kind of getting down and dirty and going after someone. I think that's a really difficult thing to do. But to get back to Carol Watson, you gave a beautiful talk about the fundamentals of research proposals, and many are, and then of course followed by choice of your endpoints and how do you put that together. And on the chat there was a lot of discussion about, and Michelle, you can also help us. I know that working at TIMI, there's a very hard line on mixing endpoints that go in two different directions, and so it is at Duke. So maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion around that. How do you present yourself when you're looking for an endpoint that both are rare, but together they then give you the power you're looking for a reasonable number of patients to be able to evaluate, and at the end of the day, clinicians need to take away the net benefit. How do you then present that in a grant funding? And I don't know if Carol's on the line. I don't know if I see you. Oh, hi, Carol. Hi, Carol. Your talk was beautiful. I'm sorry that I was late and not able to introduce you. So maybe we could have that discussion. Carol, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly think we have to keep pathophysiology in mind. And that has to be at the base. I mean, in the end, we all need the power to come to an answer that we can believe in. And that means getting enough events. But throwing different events of any kind in there just doesn't make sense. It just will confuse you. So if you can't stay in the same causal pathway, then you have to increase your sample size. You have to do it the right way to get the right number of events that make sense, not just any event. And that's my strong belief.
No, it's a really good one. Now, as someone who's done it differently as well, both ways, and I have now come to the conclusion that it does get very confusing when, for example, you mix bleeding and ischemic complications in one venue. And we've done that, I can tell you, on several trials in the past. And now I moved away, and I was able to basically say that the important endpoint I was going to be powered for was going to be my primary analysis. And then a key secondary could be that ischemic endpoint that you may not be fully powered for, but that you can set some kind of a non-inferiority margin or whatever you can do to, at the very least, be able to have some power. And Tracy, Carol, go ahead, Carol.
I think that's exactly the right way to do it. Having key secondary endpoints makes a lot of sense. But again, keeping your eye on the primary endpoint, you're going to power everything on that primary endpoint. So that's the one you have to keep your eye on.
Yeah, I think that Carol nicely touched upon this issue, that I think there's this misperception sometimes that by having a really broad composite outcome, that's somehow easier for people to achieve. Because I've sometimes heard, people say, well, I mean, like, look at that broad primary outcome. But it actually doesn't always help you. And just like Carol outlined with that TZD trial, I mean, it's ironic that had they gone with the harder outcome of CV, death, MI, or stroke, that would have actually been successful, as opposed to pulling in other outcomes. But,
so I think the point of signal to noise ratio, you want to talk about that a little bit, because that's really important. I was taught that by you guys at Timmy. So maybe you wanna talk about that a little bit, Michelle, and then maybe we'll go to Tracy.
Yeah, I mean, it only hurts you if you introduce things into your composite outcome that are actually not going to be modified. You know, you might think that, oh, well, you know, there's no harm done, but in fact, there is. It's essentially watering down your ability to show a difference. So, you know, you really have to think very carefully, just like Carol was saying, about which elements are going to go into that composite outcome. Because, for instance, you know, it might seem like a subtle difference, but you know, are you going to include any coronary revascularization, or maybe just urgent coronary revascularization? That's tough because, you know, as many of us know, that there might be patients who go for coronary revasc for rather soft indications, and those might not be modified by whatever it is, whatever intervention it is that you're studying.
That's exactly right, Michelle. I mean, if you think about it, an urgent unstable angina revasc is likely based on plaque rupture, plaque erosion, the same sort of causal pathway of acute MI. And that's different than a stable coronary patient who can't, you know, play tennis as long as they used to. You know, it's different.
Tracy?
Exactly.
Tracy, comments
I don't
here?
have much to add to the great discussion that's been going on. I think that causal pathway that Carol keeps alluding to is really key. This is partly the reason why you have to have this sort of central hypothesis when you're setting something up, because everything needs to line up. And if you're going off on a tangent with these endpoints, then it's not really fitting within that. So that's graphically how I do this in my head. You know, people often say if you increase endpoint density, you can reduce the sample size, and that's true. But your endpoints need to make sense, because if you're adding in endpoints that are not aligned with your causal pathway, all you're doing is you're increasing your alpha. So so this is really you're shooting yourself in the foot by doing that.
So the other thing that bothers me a lot on oh, great, Pam. Hey, Pam, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because can you unmute?
You're muted. Pam, you're
Unmute
muted.
first, Pam.
You're
I
muted.
got my
Pam.
face there. So a composite endpoint comment from the PROMISE trial, which was a 10,000 patient imaging trial. We added death, MI, and unstable angina hospitalization, thinking, again, the pathophysiology was that we would have less ruptured plaques if the plaques were detected by CT and taken care of by intervention. As it turned out, half of our patients had lumpy, bumpy coronaries and did not have interventions because there wasn't anything significant to intervene on. Those patients had as many hospitalizations for unstable angina over the next year, because people were terrified that 40% LAD was in jeopardy. Whereas the stress test patients, they just had the 40% LAD was just a negative stress test. They weren't admitted to the hospital. And so we actually had the other thing was the duration, and people told us it needed to be very long because it was going to be the preventive therapy that changed. So we had a 2-year median up to 4 years. We had a positive trial for death and MI at 12 months, P less than 0.05, but we weren't actually even allowed to include that KM curve in the New England Journal article because it was a secondary endpoint. Instead, we could include the primary endpoint, which was death, MI, unstable angina at 2 years, which was not significant. So we in retrospect, we totally torpedoed our study by picking that composite endpoint and by picking that time frame. So be really careful.
And I think that's what all of us realize over time as we do more trials. It's a guessing game. You have to guess what the right population is, guess what the right endpoints are, guess what the right time frame is. And if you guess right, you win. If you don't guess right, you don't. And honestly, we all want to believe it's our superior intellect that takes us there, but let's be honest, in a lot of circumstances, it's a guessing game.
I was going to add that journals are getting very, very particular about primary and secondary endpoints. in particular, secondary endpoints is almost getting to all or nothing. Either you put all your secondary endpoints out there or you put none of your secondary endpoints out there. You don't get to pick and choose which secondary endpoints you want to focus on. This is very, very, very important. So it makes you think a lot more about what to do. How do you pick the primary end? I'll put in the question of, is it advantageous to have co-primary endpoints? And it really depends. You can hedge your bet, but if you lose on one, you might lose both because they're co-primary endpoints. So I there are arguments for either way, and I'd love to hear Michelle, Roxana, and Carol's thoughts on this. I have done trials with co-primary endpoints, and I've shot myself in the foot on some of these trials before.
Yeah, again, it's a guessing game. We hope it works, so we don't know that it will.
No, it's really true.
Yeah.
You could really shoot yourself. Go ahead, Salma. Sorry, I know you've been trying to say something.
No worries. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things. One is what Dr. Wang has pointed out regarding the power and if you add more endpoints to the composite. But one way to think about it innovatively, and this is something that's now being used in clinical trials for heart failure, pioneered by the Paragon trial, is to actually leverage repeated events. So for the field of heart failure, it's not only time to the first heart failure hospitalization that matters, but it's the total heart failure hospitalizations, which makes sense again to the point that Dr. Watson made. We have to go back to our pathophysiology and also the clinical relevance. So this way, it takes into account what matters and it improves the power of the study by taking into account more events. And this will help in that aspect, avoiding adding composite that don't matter.
It's an interesting concept, though, and I'm not 100% supportive of it 100%. I think, yes, I think we need to better understand the value of the recurrent events, because if those events are occurring in a very small percentage of the patients, you are never going to show that very important, and then you power your study based on those few patients that have lots and lots of recurrent events, and the volume of events are skewed now towards a certain group of patients who have multitudes of events, then you may lose the power of a study in terms of overall mortality, which is what really, really matters. And I think one of the things we need to kind of think about that maybe in heart failure, I know we're going to be looking at the recurrent events, and I do believe we need to find a way through recurrent events because they're extremely important. They're incredibly costly. They're very, very important for us to understand how to look at them. But I do think that you could lose your benefit of the large scale, like the mortality or the overall reduction of the big events, that first event that we all care about. I'd love to hear from all of you. Michelle, maybe we'll go to you first. About
thanks, Roxana. And Selma, I mean, it is an important point that you raise. And as you say, it's been used increasingly in a lot of heart failure studies. And at TIMI, we have been doing a lot of recurrent events analyses, not as much for the primary outcome, for some of the reasons that Roxana touched upon. I mean, because there are complexities too in terms of what statistical approach you're going to use to analyze it. Because, once you have a time to first event, if you have a randomized trial, you've got sort of pure randomization at the start. Once you're then restricting it to people who are at risk for having a second event, you're sort of losing the random allocation to some extent. Exactly. And that's just some of the complexity that kind of goes into the thought process, for all of this. And I think that with the idea of co-primary outcomes, it can work. I think that there are a lot of examples of trials that have successfully employed co-primary outcomes. But the thing that you have to consider, of course, is that by and large, you're going to have to be sharing your alpha. So from a power perspective, it's challenging. I mean, the other option you have is to sort of take, there are other types of alpha sharing approaches that you can think about. that are not necessarily just a pure split. So for instance, looking at 0.025 for each of those primary outcomes. There are other approaches that you can use, like Hochberg tests and things like that. But by and large, it's still going to, there's a price to pay.
There's no free lunch.
There's no free lunch, unfortunately.
Let's turn to power calculations for a little bit, and please tell me if I'm going over time, because I can talk about this stuff for hours on end.
And I gotta say, Roxanne, if you read this chat, it sounds like everybody on this call could talk for hours about this.
I know, it's fabulous.
Roxana, go till 11:05, so plenty of time to talk.
Okay, good. Wonderful, wonderful. So let's talk about power, the power calculations, and we're all have seen the game played. You sit there and you say what's clinically acceptable, whether it's superiority or even non-inferiority. So let's just kind of get there with superiority, and we'll say, okay, we want to show and what we'll do is we'll like plan it out with different relative risk reductions of 15%, 20%, 25%, 50%.
Some of which are highly unlikely to be correct, by the way.
Exactly. And it's literally a game. And then you'll go, oh, which one of these power calculations work best for a feasible trial based on the pathobiology? And then we kind of go, well, I'll pick this one. And so that is like a real issue. And one of the things that I have seen happen, which makes me really upset, especially with peri-procedural myocardial infarction, is playing with the game so much that you can use different definitions to fit this square peg into the round hole, if you will. So coming back to our panelists, where should we go first? How should we, what's the right way to approach this? And we've seen this in the non-inferiority trials, where the margin of non-inferiority sometimes is more than half of the event, the original presumed event rate. Even greater than 50% is okay, which is not in my mind. And we see that over and over again. So let's talk about that, and then we'll come to some other very important questions that are asking about adaptive design and posterior probability and all kinds of things like that we can talk about. So who wants to go first?
Can I start just by saying I'm the wrong person to ask about power, because I actually hate that game. I really do.
Yeah.
And I find it like, okay, we think there's going to be a 40% risk reduction. Really? I don't know. That just doesn't seem possible.
Well, I guess to Carol's point, I mean, the sad reality is that as much as, I think when I went to the School of Public Health, you spend all this time working on power calculations. But in reality, what happens is you start with a dollar, the sponsor or whoever it is that you're going to be having pay for this study, you have a dollar figure and you work backwards from it. It's unfortunately the reality. And I agree. All too often, pharmaceutical companies will therefore peg in some unrealistic relative risk reduction because that's what fits their budget.
Yeah, but I think we've all learned, though, that anything above a 20% relative risk reduction is really not reality.
It's not reality at all.
It's not reality. And it's somewhere between, in the best possible therapies that we've seen available to us, it's somewhere between 12 to 16%, something like that. And maybe if we're really lucky, 15 to 20%, but never more than that. But then it begs the question again about a trial that takes 25,000 patients enrolled to show an absolute risk reduction of 1% that looks to be a relative risk reduction of 15%. And I always have a problem with that. If it takes you 22,000 patients to show a p-value, that p-value has no value at all clinically. And I've said that over and over again, but often we see that happen in large, huge, massive, millions and millions of dollars spent. Who wants to talk about that? Tracy? Should we go there?
I'll be the first to say that it's probably, and I think you'll all agree, it's easier to talk about this and then to actually do some of this sometimes, because we are constrained sometimes by reality. But my personal way of thinking about this is we all like to think that we're doing research to actually change practice. So if we're ultimately pursuing a study that isn't going to change practice, either because the endpoint is not right, reality forces us to pick an endpoint that's not right, or reality forces us to take a budget and divide it by the number of patients that you can afford. Why would you want to waste 2-3 years of your life doing something that doesn't work? So I think one of the things for this group here, especially if you're not doing the $250 million trials, you're doing your, $200,000 trial here, is pick a feasible endpoint that is incremental in terms of advancing knowledge in some way. And if you feel like you're sort of forcing a square peg into a round hole, then you need to go find a square hole somewhere else in order to do this. Don't keep trying to do that. As it relates to there was some discussion about superiority versus non-inferiority. I think Pam wrote that she's not a fan of non-inferiority trials. I actually think non-inferiority trials are, my opinion is that they're very important. We have studies that are that prove that certain medications work, and we potentially have better alternatives or cheaper alternatives or something else that we want to make sure is at least as good as. And the discussion there, you'd need a stats class, and it probably would be a year-long course just to get to the bottom of this. But if your event rates are already really low, let's say your event rates are 1% or lower, or something really low, then as long as you keep those event rates low, maybe the margin of your non-inferiority is not that important. But and your event rates are a little higher, that you want to really think about, what's the incremental value of demonstrating this. And so, usually when we're doing this, every once in a while, I'll take the design hat off, put the clinician hat on, and basically say, if I saw an event rate that was 2 times higher than standard of care, how is a clinician going to feel about this? Like, would I apply this?
I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Tracy. I also agree with Pam. I think it gets very messy. And if you look at the non-inferiority bounds of most studies, are about 30%, meaning you can have 30% more events and still be non-inferior. And that's, I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, I think some of the messiness of non-inferiority studies is that that's where actually introducing very broad composite outcomes where you don't expect some of those outcomes to be modified helps you, because here introducing noise ironically has the benefit of biasing you towards the null. And so it looks like there's no potential harm, let's say, for your drug. But it's in part because it's not a clinically meaningful outcome, as Tracy touched upon. And I think that, as we were talking about power calculations, I guess one thought that I had to encourage people to think about too, is that when you're doing the power calculation, it's also worth it to check at the same time what you expect the minimum detectable effect to be based on the number of events that you're projecting in your study. Because, one is the power calculation saying, okay, you've got 80% power to detect 20% relative risk reduction. But then you can ask the question, okay, let's say there's a 10% relative risk reduction. Do I consider that to be clinically meaningful? Because if I do, am I going to hit at p less than 0.05 for that particular hazard ratio, if that's what I end up seeing at the end of the study? So knowing what that minimum detectable effect is basically saying, okay, where is that p.05 going to become significant? And is that at a spot that I feel comfortable? And I think that can be helpful too.
Oh, that's extremely helpful. I often do this, Michelle, and I think it really does help me a lot. I mean, we, in iterations of devices, especially in the device world, the non-inferiority becomes extremely important. As you can imagine, all of the DES versus DES trials use the non-inferiority margin, trying to use the same exact endpoints. And now with the Academic Research Consortium, really making sure that people are using the same exact definition across the board, with the adjudication processes being also standardized. And we're working very, very closely across all of the AROs to do that, especially with Renato Lopez leading a CEC effort, and Ken Mahaffey and Steve Wiviot, et cetera, really, really looking to make sure that we do that. So I wouldn't underestimate, but there is a lot of games that gets played in the non-inferiority design that we should be aware of, because at the end of the day, I often say to myself, to me, I never take my clinician hat off, Tracy. I always have that on, because that is the number one reason why we're doing clinical research, to find answers for clinicians and patients alike and to improve their outcomes. This is not a game to play to get a grant funding or to give money back to industry so they can market their product. This is about patients. And so always, always keeping that important clinician hat on, but also being smart about not falling into a trap that you'll never get an answer, even though your clinical question is a very sound and valid one. And that's what Michelle is talking about, with kind of seeing, where do you think the p-value might turn positive depending on what the differential is, and then powering around that so that you could at least have some level of power to be able to show the difference, even if the difference is smaller than you initially imagined. I think that's a really, really key to success. Any comments, Salma? I know you want to.
Yeah.
Go ahead, dear.
So my thoughts is there is a role for non-inferiority trials, although it gets really difficult designing or analyzing it. But with advancement in technology and also having more safe routes of administration of drugs, randomizing to placebo is not ethical, and the only way to do it is to do it against the standard of care. And if the standard of care is effective or has high efficacy, but there's something better, I think it's going to be really hard to reach the p-value for superiority. So I think there has to be a role for it to provide good substitutes for what we have, and also have this competition. Because once the first drug or device hit the market and they show efficacy, if we limit trials to only superiority, I think we're going to be limited to what we can get as a new therapy.
Oh, that's a great point. I agree with that. We have 5 minutes left, and do want to touch a little bit on adaptive design. It was a big question, and we're seeing a lot of that now. Any thoughts, any pros, cons? Where would that fit best? Who wants to go on that? Tracy, Michelle, Paul, do you guys have any thoughts about this?
I think Tracy's trying to speak on mute.
I can try to talk a little bit about adaptive design, because we're trying to do one right now for one of our NHLBI COVID trials.
Oh, good.
And I will say that it is a pain in my, even from a protocol writing standpoint, trying to think about what the next steps are. So the challenge is, the adaptive design really has several phases, and it's contingent on certain landmarks. And so, even from a protocol standpoint, there's sort of a main protocol, and then there's sort of addendums that basically tell you, this is stage 1, and then this is what might be stage 2, and what the arms are going to look like, what the power calculation is going to change. I think they're getting to be really important, and we need to learn how to do these trials, but I might be right if I say that we're also learning how to do these trials. Because the world needs us to figure out how to do research in a faster fashion. Gail turned on her video.
No, I see Dr. Pearson. We really do want to hear what the NIH thinks about this. And I keep seeing multitudes of links on the chat for people to look at, all NIH links for everyone to look at. So, Dr. Pearson?
Well, I have more slides than time later, so it's good to talk about this now. Tracy's absolutely right that this is a strategy being widely used for the COVID therapeutic trials. I actually was thinking that it would be helpful to have some sessions on this at the next round of this curriculum. So I saw, I haven't been following the chat completely, but I saw something go by about seamless phase 2-3 transitions. And there are lots of people who are getting experience, Tracy, like you are, in the COVID trials, but also statisticians who've done these types of trials in other venues. Cancer chemotherapy is one of them, or cancer therapeutics is one of them. And I too would like to learn more about them.
No, I think it becomes also really, really important in all the phases, as you just mentioned, Dr. Pearson. And one of the things we're looking at in some of the drug development is to how do you speed up this the important not to call it warp speed for lack of a better word, but certainly just putting a little bit of the accelerator on, especially if you're seeing something really interesting coming forward, and kind of changing that phase 2A, 2B, and kind of bringing that together to find the right dose so that we can just kind of walk right in and get the best dose to move into phase 3. I think those are all really, really interesting questions. Whenever I hear the word adaptive, I always say, let's bring in a statistician to help us better understand. I think it's a really, really complicated. Dr. Merchant, thank you for coming on. Did you want to give us a comment or question, anything?
She's in the next session, Roxana.
Oh, she's on the next session. I thought maybe you wanted to.
So can I make one other comment about adaptive designs? I think a more familiar way that people have used them is to incorporate an adaptive design analysis in their statistical analysis plan. So you get to the point right before, let's say, your first interim look at the data, and you have a way that you can look at your outcomes to date and make a decision as to whether you need to increase sample size to achieve your trial objectives. And this can be done in such a way that the DSMB can make that decision without having seen actual outcome data by treatment arms, so they're not biased in that regard. And this has been used for several years in some trials that we have funded to good effect.
Yeah, and we just did this in a very large APOA1 study, working with Mike Gibson and working exactly with that. And was the DSMB was making all those decisions and kind of calculating and helping us with increasing sample size, exactly as you said. And I think it's a really, really great place for us to have discussion. So next year, Pam and Tracy, we want to hear more about these more complicated statistical, but also incredibly important because it helps us get to the answer in a much more precise way. And then the other thing I would like to see is what are we doing about, I'd love to see a session on COVID because I think the impact of COVID in patient enrollment, patient retention, and adjudication of events that could overlap some of the COVID events are going to be really, really important for us in the future, as we know there is important implication on cardiovascular outcomes in these patients. So with that, Selma, if you're okay, we can close the session. You want to close the session?
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I've learned a lot, and it was an outstanding session.
Sorry, so can I make a suggestion that we get the chat printed out to everybody? I thought it was so invaluable.
Right, and I also think there were really, there were great questions on the chat that we didn't get to address, and it's really great for us to, as we build the platform and the blueprint for next year, of the kinds of things we need to kind of include. And then maybe, because this is a webinar, perhaps thinking about another sort of a quick follow-up to this meeting, maybe sometime before all of a whole year of waiting, maybe twice a year we need to meet, but that's up to you guys.
Roxana, I'll remind you that we have 2 more sessions this year. So
oh, good.
This is a year-long. This is a year-long experience. It may seem like longer.
So let's keep adding this into the equation and keep putting this into the next deck of cards for evaluation. To me, this was the best session.
Roxanne, I'm sorry, can I
Absolutely.
make one last point? I think Tracy brought it up, and I always taught this as a medical student. Tailoring your ideas into a story that you can tell. This could be your elevator pitch. It's how you frame your specific aims. It's a story that makes sense.
And specifically,
Hear, hear.
NIH wants to hear the story that matters to the public, not just to you or the company or the drug or the device, but to the patient and to the outcomes of that patient. That's what the NIH cares about. Isn't that right, Dr. Pearson?
It is, and please call me Gail. We're not very formal here at NIH. We also want at least 85% power, just FYI.
All right, we'll go on to the next session. Thank you all. That was a very, very, very rich discussion, and I'm glad we had extra time to do it. Tracy, you're still on as moderator, and welcome to Eileen Handberg as well, and we'll turn it over to you for the next plenary.
Actually, I'll let Pooja take over. She's in charge.
Oh, Pooja, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Not a problem. Hi, everybody. I'm Pooja Parikh. I'll be co-moderating with Drs. Hamburg and Dr. Wang on our next session, which is entitled, How Will Clinical Trials Change? And so we have this amazing panel of speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Gail Pearson, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to have her introduced anyway. Dr. Pearson is director of the NHLBI's Office of Clinical Research. She also serves as Associate Director of the Division of Cardiovascular Sciences at the NHLBI. And today she's going to be speaking to us on a very important topic, research in the wake of COVID-19. Dr. Pearson?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and the previous session could not have teed up my talk better. The organizers did ask me to cover some additional topics. So as I said, I have more slides than time, so I'm going to take you through a very high-level overview of various things and allow you to have that all-important opportunity for individual education because the slides have a lot of resources in them that are available to you. So I have no relationships to disclose, and I'm supposed to say these are my opinions and not official opinions. I'll let you review the summary on your own, but I want to highlight two things. One is partnerships, and the other is that NHLBI is here to help, and I'll be talking more about both of these things. So for the first part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our current approach to COVID-19. There is a lot going on here as illustrated by this graphic. You can see it was last updated in August, but these are still sort of the fundamental activities. I want to highlight the public-private partnership that is active. This is where a lot of the therapeutic trials are going on. As a pediatrician, I'm also pleased to note that we're supporting pregnant women and children. And I'm going to come back to this component with the SEAL program, which is important because there's a lot of social and behavioral components to how this virus is affecting the country and the world. And it's important that NIH is taking note of this. So just very briefly, the trials are only probably a few of which are summarized here, and I'm not going to go into detail about any of them, but the goal was to cover the spectrum of disease from pre-hospital to post-hospital and convalescent. We've been hearing a lot about the long haulers, the recovered patients who still have symptoms, and we're just sort of ramping up to figure out what to do about them, both adults and children. But as you can see, there's a lot going on here, and some of these got launched within a matter of weeks. So this has been an extraordinary exercise in how to be nimble and efficient and get trials started. NHLBI has developed the CONNECTS network, the collaborating network of networks for evaluating COVID-19 and therapeutic strategies. There are a number of public and private partners in this. And the idea is that to integrate some of the networks that NHLBI is already funding to align with others, including Operation Warp Speed, the NIH Active program that I described earlier, the FDA, and others, and to use this master protocol adaptive design approach we just talked about. And as I said a minute ago, focused so that different trials would be focused on the stage of the disease or the clinical setting. There's a whole committee set up to prioritize therapeutic candidates, as you might imagine. There's been a lot of interest in many therapeutic candidates that might be helpful in the setting of the pandemic. So there needed to be a way to prioritize which ones of those went into trials first. So the whole idea is a nimble approach that will allow us to shift the focus as new science emerges, as it is almost every day. So here's one slide on adaptive trial designs. I am by no means an expert in this, but the fundamental approach is you start out with, let's say, 4 arms, standard of care and 3 agents. And you do an interim analysis, which might be earlier than you would in a regular trial and might be more liberal than the criteria would be in a regular trial. And you decide that agent C really doesn't look like it's going to make it to the finish line. So you stop that arm and you add an arm for agent D. And then maybe you do another interim analysis and agent A doesn't look so good. And so you end up with these 3 candidates at the end. I'm quite sure this is a headache, as Tracy described, but it's also a way of testing a lot of different things at the same time. And so has the potential to be extremely efficient. So the scientific scope of the NHLBI's Connect program includes not just the trials that I talked about, but observational studies, which I'll mention in a minute, a community engagement piece, and other analytics and mechanistic studies. And as you may have seen in an NIH news release this morning, we expect everyone to share their data and specimens. So we have put together C4, this collaborative cohort of cohorts to study COVID-19. NHLBI has a long history of funding cohort studies. You're probably all familiar with Framingham, but there are many more. And the goal is to use our cohorts to look at the role of cardiovascular, pulmonary, and hematologic dysfunction in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. We're going to employ 14 cohort studies with over 50,000 people. These are highly diverse populations. And all of them have had deep phenotyping before the pandemic, including imaging, biomarkers, social determinants of health, and the like. And then they're going to undergo subsequent exams and deep phenotyping. This will be done in collaboration with other NIH institutes. I mentioned the SEAL Alliance earlier. This is my boss here, Gary Gibbons. He's the director of NHLBI, and of course, Francis Collins, the director of NIH, and Eliseo Perez, who's the director of the National Institute on Minority Health. And they have gotten together with this Community Engagement Research Alliance, the goal of which is to involve diverse racial and ethnic populations, both in providing them information about COVID. And I'm sorry if everyone could mute. And also to try to take steps through engaging the community to maximize trust and minimize suspicion about both healthcare and participating in research. So you can't ask a pediatrician to give a talk without getting one slide at least on pediatrics. So you may be aware that this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children has emerged as essentially a new disease in children during the pandemic. So NIH has a priority in understanding this along with all of the rest of the aspects of pediatric COVID. And so there's a collaboration among my institute, the Child Health Institute, and the Allergy and Infectious Disease Institute. And we have already launched one MISC study that's focused on cardiac phenotyping. There will be a companion one launched to look at immunophenotyping. We plan long-term follow-up, and there's also coordination with the CDC study, and all of these data will go into a data platform with wide data sharing. So The main topic of the talk, it was meant to be the effects of COVID-19 on research. I think you all are probably aware that many trials have been affected. We think at least a third of our trials have been affected, but probably more as research institutions shut down and people are concerned about going to sites to participate in research during these times. We've seen an increased role for electronic informed consent, and I've listed here the URL to the FDA guidance on this for your information. We've all been doing remote clinical visits, and so there's no reason why there can't be remote clinical trial visits. And there's even the opportunity for remote sample collection, including small volumes of blood collection through kits that can be used at home. Remote monitoring is something else that's being done increasingly, and the FDA has guidance on this. NHLBI understands that people still may have to spend some money on their clinical trial grants, even while they're not really operating at full speed. We're encouraging fiscal discipline. And NIH has reported a number of grant flexibilities during this period. And again, I've provided the URL here. After COVID, who knows what's going to happen to the biomedical research budget? I certainly don't. But that aside, I think we can look at some of the lessons from the trials we've launched in COVID during this time and the way we've collaborated. So more efficient trials. Warp speed may not be achievable, but we should at least think about it. And then what's the role of existing infrastructure? There are many trial networks out there funded by NHLBI and otherwise, and if they were to collaborate, we could maybe get things done faster. I know Raina's going to talk about this. I'm going to touch on it a little bit, but why not increase the use of digital technology in trials? And of course, such an important lesson from the pandemic, even if we should have learned it before now, is the need to involve women and members of underrepresented minority groups in our trials, in planning our trials, in participating in our trials, in leading our trials, and also the importance of community engagement, I think, has been elevated through the pandemic. So I'm just going to mention this briefly. This was a white paper by Dr. Marquis Gravel that was published in Circulation last year, looking at technology-enabled clinical trials. All of these things, of course, have downsides, but there is, I think, a lot of promise in scraping electronic health records, not only for trial planning, but also for collection of data and ascertainment of certain endpoints. Mobile apps, biosensors, and wearables also can help us by expanding the pool of patients we can recruit, by facilitating informed consent, and by tracking trial participants, for example, through geofencing, which I'll mention in a minute. You can even do trials with no sites. Yesterday, we heard about the cost drivers of clinical trials. Certainly, if you didn't have to have sites, trials would be a lot cheaper. And I've learned from participating in a Down syndrome research program that families are much more interested in participating in trials if they don't have to travel somewhere and there's less burden on them. So Abhinav Sharma, who's at McGill, who writes a lot in this space, this is from his paper in JACC in 2018, shows the trajectory of digital health tech and clinical trials. And I would hope that after the current pandemic, this line would just pretty much go straight up. So geofencing. Geofencing is what allows Starbucks to tell you when you're nearby that you're nearby and here's a coupon. It's location-based targeting. People have used it to put an electronic fence, if you will, around hospitals. And so you can tell whether a patient in your trial has gone into a hospital, and if so, for what purpose. So this is a lot more effective than asking them if they've been hospitalized in the past 6 months, which often they don't remember. And they have an app on their phone, they go in the hospital and it asks them, why are you here? And so they can communicate with the study team about this and get more accurate data. Naveen Pereira is using this in the follow-up phase of the Taylor PCI trial, which was presented earlier this year at the ACC. So NHLBI really has a strong commitment to diversity. And I want to turn now to some of the activities at NIH that are going on in this arena. It's become clear through peer review that members of underrepresented groups don't do as well in peer review. So the Center for Scientific Review, which oversees the peer review of most grants submitted to NIH and is led by Dr. Nani Burns, has undertaken an anonymization study. So they took 1,200 applications, 400 from Black PIs, 400 from matched white PIs, 400 from randomly selected white PIs, and they were reviewed both in a standard and anonymized form. Data collection and analysis went on over the past couple of years. The findings are just being evaluated and prepared for submission. So it'll be interesting to see if this is a strategy that can help improve peer review outcomes for underrepresented groups. They're also doing, in some ways, a clinical trial. They're piloting a multi-stage, partially double-blinded review that has a couple of tiers. They're doing that this fall for a certain group of R01s, and it involves an editorial board and what we would think of as sort of normal peer review by subject matter experts, and there's some interchange among these groups before a final score is arrived at. And so this is ongoing and something to look for as well. What does NIH policy require? Well, it requires that we include women and minorities in clinical research in proportion to the how they're affected by the disease or condition in question, and to include children unless there's a reason why not, like they don't have the disease, they don't get the disease. NIH has resources for helping with recruiting populations that aren't always recruited as well into trials. This is one example. Janine Clayton leads the Office of Research in Women's Health, and they've put together an outreach toolkit. So they have case studies, in this case, a diabetes education program, and they evaluated those, looked at the primary barriers to enrollment, successful recruitment strategies. This falls under the common sense category, is to empowering community partners to recruit participants and make sure that IRB materials are culturally appropriate. Most IRB materials are meant to be appropriate for lawyers, and we need to work on making them more interpretable by regular people. And then it gives you some retention strategies. The 21st Century Cures Act updated the NIH inclusion policy and procedures and now requires that phase 3 clinical trials report their results by sex, gender, race, and ethnicity. So this means you have to recruit enough people to do that in order to succeed at this. And why is that? Well, NHLBI has a strategic vision that focuses on inclusion, and one of the main reasons to do this is to look at factors that account for differences in health among populations. Again, something that the pandemic has highlighted. So how are we doing with this at NHLBI? Well, if you consider all clinical research, we're doing pretty well with women, not too bad with minority groups, with clinical trials, I think the same picture. However, with phase 3 trials, we still have work to do with racial and ethnic minorities to recruit more people into them. I think I'm probably at the end of my time. So I'll just leave you with this. Normally, I wouldn't highlight my own manuscript in this way, but we were invited by the American Heart Journal, myself and others in my division, to write a paper that talks about how the Institute is thinking about cardiovascular clinical trials. And there's a lot of useful information in it. We fund trials through all phases, through multiple mechanisms, and I encourage you to take a look at this. NHLBI funded 132 clinical trials with a budget of $87 million for those in FY19. And 24% of those, you'll be happy to know, were awarded to early stage investigators. So there's 2 slides here of resources, and I put my name at the top, because the most important resource for you is the staff at NHLBI and other institutes who can help you. We're happy to help you. There's no stupid question. There's no reason not to reach out to us. Talking to us does not influence the outcome of peer review. It can only really help you. And so you have the slides. There are other resources here, but I'm mindful of the time. So thank you. I'm delighted to have been here. And again, NHLBI is here to help.
That was great. Dr. Pearson, thank you so much for going over some of the perspectives from the NHLBI. I'm sure it's going to generate quite a bit of discussion afterwards in terms of our discussion section after. Our second speaker today is Dr. Raina Merchant. Dr. Merchant is an Associate Vice President at Penn Medicine, and she's also Director of the Penn Medicine Center for Digital Health. She served as one of the leaders in examining the association between digital media and health behaviors, and she'll be talking to us about research in the digital age. Dr. Merchant?
Thank you so much, and I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much, Gail. That was a fantastic presentation, and I learned so much. So I was asked to talk about COVID-19 and research in the digital age, and I hope that this will generate some excitement for thinking about the really sort of emerging ways that digital platforms can be used in research and ways that we may not have initially anticipated. Let's see. There's a little delay on the advancing. So these are just disclosures. I have a R01 from NHLBI. I'm co-I on an R01 and several grants related to digital data, but there are no conflicts with any of the work that I'm talking about today. So I want to start with talking about an area of research that my colleagues David Ash and Dan Rader and I are calling the field of social mediomics. It wasn't as if we didn't need another ohm. So there's like the metabolome, the genome, the proteome. There are so many different ohms. And so we wanted to characterize an area as the social mediome and really think about this area of study as being social mediomics. And you could also just think of this as like digital mediomics as well. And really, we think of this as the study of the collective characterization and quantification of social media or digital data that really reflect the structure, function, and dynamics of individuals or populations. And so because I wanted to think about this in terms of public health emergencies, I included a slide from a paper that we published in New England Journal of Medicine almost 10 years ago that looked at really sort of early uses of how social media could be used to inform emergency preparedness efforts. And really thinking back there, if we wanted to really reach broad populations, if we wanted to be able to interact with people in real time to collect data, that was some of the things that we sort of described in those efforts. And I think that they're still very relevant today. So sort of fast forward to the current pandemic. And here we again took another look at how have these tools really changed and sort of how are we using sort of social media in this response to coronavirus and where are the missed opportunities? I think really the way that sort of the thinking around social media has changed is it's no longer just about sort of reach, but also thinking about the incredible influence it has in being able to bring about behavior change. And so really there's this opportunity to better harness these digital tools with attentiveness to all of the risks associated with them, but really think about how can we better as researchers, as public health scientists, think about wielding these tools for better engaging with reaching and making a difference in behavioral outcomes for patients. I like this next example from a platform that was pretty popular many years ago. It was called Foursquare. And I was reminded of this also when Gail was talking about geofencing. But the way that Foursquare worked is basically you would check into a particular place when you got there. So This is the ACC, so maybe we wouldn't be checking into a fast food place, but let's say that you were checking into a fast food place, and then you were going to the gym, then you were going to work, then you stop off at CVS, pick up prescriptions, you go to clinic, and then you go to all these different places. And so what this app allowed you to do was to create this sort of map of all the different places that people went that would give you a better sense of the exposures and the locations. And you can imagine for research that if you had a sense of all of the different both places and spaces that people were inhabiting, that this might give you a better sense holistically of their cardiovascular risk, of their related exposures. And so what Foursquare would do at the end of the year is sort of create this heat map that showed people different locations. This was also used in public health emergencies and thinking about spread of infectious diseases. And if you could really see where people through these social apps were connecting, that you might have a better understanding of spread. And so I mentioned this example in thinking about how in this era of COVID, will we have a better sense of individuals' exposures, the information that they're accessing, and both things relative to place and space. This is another example of sort of a map or a dashboard which has emerged. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. Hopkins did a really phenomenal job of creating this dashboard that really shows sort of cases and outcomes associated with COVID that are very specific to region. And the map sort of tracks the changes in cases over time. And I think the other layer that, as researchers were really interested in are about what about the information that's being generated, not just about sort of like cases, but all the other sort of associated factors that go along with the disease. And what can we learn by using sort of novel and emerging sort of digital platforms, which provide additional information sort of about spread of disease or about exposures, about cardiovascular risk, about a range of sort of health-related factors. And so this is an image that was posted by The Economist, which basically looked at Instagram. So when you're taking pictures and posting them onto Instagram, they're associated with specific geotags that you could then use to identify how people had moved through sort of time and space. And so here, they were able to look at locations of Instagram users and where they traveled after having exposure to COVID. And so you could apply that to your own sort of research questions and thinking about how the information that's embedded in these platforms really gives you a sense of exposures in people's particular movements. This is relevant for COVID, but also how we think about other trials and other studies that might be related to cardiovascular health. This is another example that looked at smart thermometers. So we heard from Gail a lot about sort of digital tools and ways in which they are remote sensors for information that people are both sharing, both knowingly and unknowingly. And so here with the example of smart thermometers, these were used very early on for trying to identify early sort of like hotspots that were emerging relative to COVID. So I'm not sure if the users of the smart thermometer were aware that this information was being used to sort of create these geographic maps, but it gives you a sense of how you could have a better pulse on a population by understanding sort of how people's movements were happening and getting a specific vital sign. And we could think about the implications of that in cardiovascular health in terms of being able to look at heart rate monitors and things that people are eating, their exercise, just a whole host of things that if we could track really the cardiovascular health of the nation, that might allow us to allow certain insights and predictions around health. This is an image that was from the New York Times that was emerged really early, and this was looking at using information from mobile phones. And so this looked at where Americans didn't stay home even as the virus spread. And so again, using the accelerometer and other GPS tracking information within the phone, you can have a better sense of individuals' sort of spread in response to sort of public health recommendations. And so the phone, whether using it specifically as a research tool or using it to understand more about population dynamics, that here you could use this to really understand the direct impact of sort of a policy recommendation. And then you can also map this and sort of think about how making certain changes to messages might change this distribution over time. This is also relevant for many of the apps which are emerging around contact tracing, which is a really important part of this COVID response. But thinking about how information in the phone really provides an incredible amount of data. So I talked about just the geotags associated with your Instagram photos, the accelerometer and other things within your mobile phone, the things that individuals are posting, and then also the things that you might be entering your actual health data, like the smart thermometers, and being able to look at a collection of that information can be really important for things like contact tracing or thinking about particular, again, sort of exposures and understanding risk. Our own group at Penn Medicine did some work early on where we created a COVID-19 US Twitter map. And this is being used by several different health departments for tracking information about mental health of affected communities. So here we have information about comparing posts about loneliness and social isolation. We looked at anxiety and depression and track these over time relative to the burden of cases in a particular region. We also look at what are people talking about, so the top Twitter topics that are by region, to really understand more about public health sentiment and sort of what are people feeling, what are they most concerned about, as a mechanism for being able to direct specific messaging. This can be very relevant for cardiovascular research, and I'm using this as an example for thinking about how we can collect this data sort of as a remote sensor of individuals' knowledge, their awareness, their understanding, their education. It really can provide a lot of information without actually sort of directly asking people, but more so represents what they're spontaneously generating. We looked at top symptoms, and we were able to identify that people were talking about symptoms of COVID before they were added to the CDC list of symptoms, because people were already experiencing them and sharing them online. And then also then we look at sort of sentiment and engagement by region on the figure to the left. And then finally, sort of what are some of the platforms that are kind of combining this digital remote data with ways for directly doing research at the bedside. So the Way to Health platform was developed by my colleagues Kevin Volpe and David Ash. It's an NIH-funded platform, which basically allows you to recruit patients, consent patients, embed surveys, directly pay patients, and we have a plugin which allows us to collect digital data that people have donated and are willing to share with us. It connects with electronic health records. It has a randomization feature. It allows you to do a lot of behavioral incentive studies for testing differences in financial models and financial incentives. And it's a HIPAA compliant platform. So thinking about merging these two concepts of being able to do clinical trials and other research, like having a digital platform that sort of brings these two sort of sources together has been really helpful. And also it has texting capabilities, so being able to text and communicate with patients, to administer surveys, ask questions, and other ways of interacting with patients. And so I use this as one example that's been used across several different health systems of ways to sort of bring together this data for research. And so finally, I think that these remote sensors can provide health insights at the level of both individuals and populations, and that we can really use this for remote recruitment, which is particularly relevant in the era of COVID, that can be enabled through these connected technologies and allow us to still interact and engage with patients. And that these wearable and other digital devices really can enable remote tracking and identification of symptoms, and importantly, this engagement piece of how do we interact with individuals and patients. I think my view is that this will inform the advancement of science and public health, and that really the future of medicine will require integration of these new data sources for managing health and delivering healthcare. So thank you so much.
Dr. Merchant, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. It's definitely generated a lot of discussion on our chat forum here, which we'll get to when we get to our discussion at the end. So we're actually going to switch over to our fourth speaker, Dr. Megan Coyle-Wright. Dr. Coyle-Wright, Megan, she's an interventional cardiologist and associate director of the structural heart program over at Dartmouth. And she's one of the leading experts in shared decision-making, and especially with relation to transcatheter valve therapies. And today, Megan will be speaking to us about patient-centered and patient-led research.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh and Dr. Hamburg. And I'm so excited to follow Dr. Pearson, who talked about the importance of women and others that are underrepresented in medicine leading clinical trials. And then to have Dr. Merchant follow that with obviously a clear example of a woman who's doing that work, and inspiring enough that we've got Dr. LaPrincess Brewer, who's in the audience, who's already an established investigator in her own right, making links between what Dr. Merchant's presenting and what she's going to be doing. So it's really an exciting forum. I'm going to be talking about patient-centered research, and my disclosures are I'm just trying to recruit you all into this young field. There's lots of room for talented people, especially those that have the characteristics we need: resiliency, being relentless. I know there's a lot of people that fit that in the audience, so hope to spark your interest in this topic. I might rename it and say radical transformation of clinical trial design and execution by engaging patients. And we need people who are relentless here, because these aren't the hard outcomes that Dr. Watson talked about. We are just starting to understand how to measure what's important to patients and how to communicate it to our scientist colleagues. And so we're going to need to look to leaders who come before us, but we also need to create a lot of it on our own. And part of that is first changing who is in the room. Dr. Freischlag and Files wrote about this in JAMA 2020, talking about some of the barriers to including diverse folks in our field. And it is important that we change both the investigators and making sure the patients are present. So in order to do that, I first had to follow Dr. Tracy Wang's advice to do a self-inventory. Did I have the skill sets that I needed to do this work? I had to seek out a mentor. I didn't have someone in my small circle around me that could guide me through the measurement of patient preferences and patient-centered research. So first I got my act together, made sure I had a small body of research. Then I got some funding. Then I went and sought a mentor that might help guide me and help me understand the methodology. Dr. Nananda Cole, who's an investigator with years of experience in shared decision-making research, is now my mentor. And I'll end the talk with a study looking at patient preferences in the treatment of aortic stenosis, and what we found might surprise you. Specifically, though, we ask different questions when we come from different backgrounds. We actually are able to recruit different kinds of patients when we bring a diverse coalition together. This recent study out of the European Journal of Heart Failure showed that when women were involved in clinical trials as the investigators and authors, we saw more engagement with diverse patients. So I'm just so happy this group is here today. My goals over the next few minutes are first to define patient-centered research, acknowledge our past inequities. I'll describe specific component of patient-centered research, that is patient preference research, and then with you and the panel, we'll brainstorm how we can radically restructure clinical trial execution. What is patient-centered research? To be honest, we have struggled with the definition ourselves, those that are working in the field. This was an NHLBI group that I was involved in, where we were looking at priorities for patient-centered research in valvular heart disease, and we spent the first number of hours just trying to figure out how to define it. Isn't it all research? Are we all here for the patient after all? Isn't that what we're trying to understand, is how to help patients live better lives, live longer? But there are some distinct components of it. And the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, also called PCORI, is a good place to start to understand. They define it as patient-centered outcome research is such that assists patients and clinicians to make informed patient-centered decisions reflective of the patient voice, making sure to be inclusive of diverse patients' preferences, their autonomy, and needs. When you sit down with your patient and you're trying to decide how to treat aortic stenosis, TAVR versus SAVR, what is the research that can help you present those options to patients in a way that is easy for them to understand and allows them to communicate their preferences? As part of patient-centered outcome research, we also have patient-reported outcomes. These are distinct from the hard outcomes that we talked about that Dr. Watson was describing, like death or stroke or MI, but looking at those outcomes for which patients define for us their perceptions of it. You know, we might have something that is like the KCCQ, where patients are filling out a validated survey about their perceptions of heart failure, which is different from the NYHA class, where we decide which category they go into. Taking a step further in patient-centered outcome research, we have patient-defined outcomes. In patient-reported outcomes, we're still making a list for patients to fill out. But when patients can help us define the outcomes that are most important to them, then we can perhaps inform our trials, including the hard outcomes, but also understanding patient preferences that may actually inform regulatory decisions down the line, as well as how we communicate with patients regarding the results. I would like to just make sure we acknowledge our past inequities in research. It's important when we think about patient preferences to ensure we have a diverse group of patients. Many of our studies continue to be predominantly white and male, and we know that many of the inequities within clinical trial research has led to a great deal of distrust among communities for good reason that we need to address each time we're trying to engage patients, whether it be in clinical trial design, selection of patient outcomes, or just participation in the clinical trial. We've been kind of walking around the patients rather than including them in the process. And we see that enrollment of women and racial and ethnic minorities, for example, in heart failure clinical trials, has been lagging. We may see some improvement in racial and ethnic minorities, although still falling behind in African American and Latino recruitment, but we actually haven't seen a big change in the proportion of women who are in our clinical trials. We need to think about changing who's in the room. We heard a little bit about some of the guidelines from NIH that may help us, but I do want to also identify that during COVID-19, there is a significant cost to our most diverse researchers. Whether you're a caregiver, a mama or a dad, or you have elderly parents to care for, this is impacting our research careers. So part of our discussion about being inclusive in order to lead to diverse patients in our studies is going to be figuring out how we support each other in this time. I know I can say as a mom of 4, it's been hard to balance all of it. So kudos to all of you for participating in this meeting as well. A little bit of tidbit about patient preference research and some unusual findings. We do get patient preferences wrong. I can't tell you how many times I've followed someone on the podium who said, let me tell you what's most important to patients, but without any data behind it. Patient preference research is really important to many stakeholders, including the FDA. In fact, they're leading the way in a lot of different strategies. They have a culture of patient engagement. And when you have a therapy for which it is highly patient sensitive, they are going to think about patient preference research when they're thinking about regulatory approval for devices or drugs. This is well described within the FDA and helps us understand that this field has a bright future. Here's an example of patient preference research. This is from Shelby Reed out of Duke, which is asking patients about how they weigh the risks and benefits of transcatheter mitral valve repair using a discrete choice experiment. One of the neat findings from this study is that patients didn't care as much about repeat heart failure hospitalization than we thought, if the times in between they had high quality of life, really challenging our outcome selection. Let me just close the discussion with a study that's ongoing with myself and my mentor that has some surprising findings. We actually recruited patients to help us understand what was most important to them in the treatment of aortic stenosis. One of the key features of well-done patient preference studies are make sure that you target the patient population that's affected. We sought the experts. These were folks that had already undergone surgical or transcatheter aortic valve replacement or had made a selection for palliative care in the treatment of aortic stenosis. These are the experts, and we asked them, what's most important to you using nominal group technique? This is a technique that's distinct from focus groups. I'm not standing at the front of the room in my white coat asking patients. Patients generate on their own the goals and preferences that are most important to them in their treatment. They then work together to rank them, and we do card sorting activities to put them into clusters, creating a cognitive map for how they think about the process of treating this disease condition. I was thinking they would say something like, I want to avoid pacemaker, or I want to lower my risk of stroke, or go home as fast as possible. What did we find was one of the most important attributes for patients? Actually, it was their relationship with the medical team caring for them. more than distinguishing between the two therapies. They were looking for trust, good communication, and the experience of the team. Are those things that we're measuring or valuing or necessarily training ourselves on to a great degree? Very interesting results as we go forward in this patient preference research. So we talked about what is patient-centered research, acknowledging some of our past inequities, and describing a specific category of patient-centered research, which is patient preference research. Let's brainstorm together how we can think about moving forward, especially in light of the inequities that have been laid bare by COVID-19. Well, when we're thinking about our trials, we definitely want to see and engage patients as experts. We need to develop best practices in how we bring patients to our committees, their roles and responsibilities. And in that, we need to budget for increased support. If this is effort that we value, it needs to be paid for. It needs to be a line item on that budget to make sure that we listen to the patients and how we can bring them into this work. And finally, as this session is doing, we need to support diverse researchers. It matters who's in the room. We ask different questions. We look at the science in different ways. We definitely need the best and brightest talent. So I look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thanks so much for that excellent talk, Dr. Quara. You brought up a lot of points that will certainly be discussed in the panel discussion later. You know, we do have a recorded talk by Dr. Tina Hernandez-Boussard. Dr. Walsh and Dr. Wang, do we have time to show the recording, or?
It's like all of our speakers are very obediently to their timeline, which is rare in these talks. So, and the talks have just really been amazing. I just want to hear more. So I think Stephanie and Jacob are lining up the recording right now.
Great, and just to introduce Dr. Hernandez-Boussard, she's an associate professor in medicine, biomedical data science and surgery at Stanford. Her talk today is going to be on registries, EMR, and other real-world evidence research, and it's going to be a recorded talk.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about this increasingly important topic, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. Today, I want to talk to you about using real-world data for research and clinical assertions. So before I get started, I think it's important to understand the 21st Century Cures Act that was passed by Congress in 2016. The 21st Century Cures Act will streamline drug and device approval through modifications to the discovery, development, and delivery components of the regulatory process. Importantly, the 21st Century Cures Act has paved a pathway to allow real-world evidence outside of the randomized controlled trial to be used for clinical assertions. Furthermore, regulators must incorporate information on the patient experience. So, what does that mean? I want to talk a little bit about the difference between real-world data and real-world evidence. Well, real-world clinical assertions are generated from evidence developed from real-world data. Real-world data is data related to the patient's health and health care. It includes information on their general health status, well-being, etc. And importantly, this information is gathered from routine clinical care. This can be EHRs, registries, wearables, claims data, etc. And these data are likely to better reflect the general population seeking treatment rather than the select patients enrolled in a clinical trial. And then real-world evidence is obtained from these real-world data. These often include information on potential risks or benefits from a product, and importantly, we can assess information at the population level. So the second aspect of the 21st Century Cures Act was using patient experience data, also known as patient-reported outcomes. These are typically side effects or symptoms that can be only reported by the patient, such as headache, fatigue, depression, etc. And these endpoints allow us to incorporate quality of life and patient goals into treatment decisions. However, meaningful patient experience data is often not routinely captured in our healthcare records. Often, PROs are collected through prospective qualitative studies that are timely and expensive. When they are captured in the EHRs, they're currently captured generally in a clinical note, and it's difficult to extract this information for secondary use. This, of course, requires advanced informatics to mine the data, and therefore there's a lack of population-level data on meaningful patient experiences that can guide treatment and policy. So in my work, we use electronic healthcare records to really advance the use of real-world data. First, as you know, there's been a widespread adoption of EHRs, making them accessible to most healthcare centers. EHRs include granular data on care processes and outcomes, clinical decisions, and sometimes patient surveys, which therefore might have the opportunity to allow you to assess patient-reported outcomes. And we can use these data generally to improve healthcare delivery by developing clinical decision support tools, performing predictive analytics, or streamlining evidence generation. However, EHRs also have many challenges when we try and use them. Importantly, EHRs were developed for billing and not for research. Therefore, they're not organized by patient and episode. The reliability of documentation is variable. We have to deal with missing data, incorrect data, and often out-of-date data. And finally, the interoperability or exchange of information across systems is limited due to technical and algorithmic challenges, as well as incentive disconnects. And so when the FDA thinks about using real-world evidence for clinical assertions, they take into account these challenges when using EHRs. And so they always ask, what questions can be asked using real-world data? How many patients can be assessed, and is there an opportunity to look at rare outcomes? How is inherent variations in care addressed in real-world data? How you deal with data quality, as I mentioned, the accuracy, missingness, relative endpoints. Is there a role for inferiority designs within the real-world data? And what is the pre-specified design for analysis? So let me start with one of the studies we have done using real-world data in cardiovascular medicine. Here we have developed a framework for identifying cardiovascular features in EHRs. And what I mean by that is we've developed technology to extract information from EHRs, both in the structured and unstructured components of the EHR data. And then we compare precision and recall amongst these different components of the EHR to identify what can be used for clinical assertions and what might need other sources of data. Now, in order to do this study, we got a consensus list of cardiovascular features important for inclusion and exclusion criteria in clinical trials, including diseases, procedures, medications, etc. And we used an EHR data set of about 11,000 patient records between 2010 and 2016. And so for this study, we were trying to assess regulatory grade and how we can meet regulatory grade standards using EHRs. So first we had to define what was the cutoff for regulatory grade in this study. And to do this, we reviewed several RCTs in cardiovascular medicine and looked at assertions comparing study arms. And we found that in general, we seek about a 10 to 20% benefit between arms. Therefore, we set a recall threshold of 85%. Recall or sensitivity tells me that of the total features we identify, how many do we miss? So a 10 to 20% inaccuracy and the ability to identify features roughly translates to what is being used in the randomized control arms to compare trials. We want to be sure that we aren't more than 20% inaccurate so we can meet that threshold of comparing arms. We then set the precision threshold to 90%. Now, precision tells us if a feature of the features we identified, how many are correct. And usually we're less tolerant with precision, therefore we set a higher threshold because this could lead to inaccurate information being added to the data set. So for example, if I say somebody's taking a medication and they aren't, I'm adding information to the data set that's false. So based on these thresholds, we developed AI technologies, mainly NLP and machine learning, to identify and extract features from structured and unstructured data in the EHRs. And so what we found, this is a table of the diseases and procedures we identified. I don't want you to look at all of this information, but I think it's important to identify the overall theme that we found for this. So first we looked at diseases and procedures. And when you look at identifying hyperlipidemia, coronary artery disease, etc., we saw consistently that trying to capture this information in EHR structured data gave us very low recall, but adequate precision. When we then tried to extract these features from unstructured notes, we got much higher recall, above 90%, and very high precision also. When we looked at procedures, the structured data gave us very high precision. And that's likely because these are billable procedures, and therefore they're going to be very well documented in structured data. However, for recall, we found that it was extremely low using the structured data. And then in the unstructured data, we had very high precision and recall. We also looked at medications and laboratory values. And so not surprisingly, we found looking at medications, unstructured data had very high recall and precision. These are often recorded as structured data and will be well captured in this structured data as we show. But we were also able to very accurately extract this information from unstructured data using clinical notes and text for lab results. Unfortunately, we did not have the lab results in the structured data of this EHR data set. But when we look at the unstructured data, we again had very high both recall and precision. So when defining regulatory grade, we can use real-world evidence, and this work really highlights how we can best identify different features needed to identify cardiovascular cohorts in EHR structured and unstructured data. We set measurable criteria for both recall and precision. It's important to note that the reason why recall is so often not reported in the literature is because it's very labor-intensive to capture. For example, in a study evaluating cholesterol-lowering drugs for heart attack, a data scientist may poll all patients who meet this criteria using structured data, medication lists or problem lists. This may result in the identification of 300 patients of a cohort of 10,000 patients. Now, the data scientist would need to next review the charts for those 300 patients to confirm that the correct conditions are referred in the clinical narrative. So this narrative, this assesses precision, and we can go through the 300 notes. However, to assess recall, we would need to go through the 10,000 patients and identify how many patients we missed. So you can see it's much harder to get at recall, and it's much more labor intensive. So next, I want to show you another example of how we use real-world evidence to look at representativeness of randomized controlled trials. And for this one, I'm going to use an example of prostate cancer, but you can imagine you could do this for any clinical trial. So what we did for this study is there was a dream challenge, which was a crowdsourcing challenge where a group of scientists put together 4 phase 3 randomized controlled trials, and they put it out to the public, and they the challenge was who could identify the best prognostic model based on these 4 RCTs. And so the winner of the challenge identified a penalized Cox regression model that was able to predict mortality with a very, with an adequate accuracy of 0.79. So importantly, these data were made available to the public. So we were very interested in looking at these randomized controlled trials and seeing how can we incorporate these models into our data set. So first, we looked at the demographics, and not surprisingly, we found very important differences in the patient demographics between patients actually seeking care in the real world setting, so in our EHRs, versus the patients that were included in the randomized controlled trial. We saw stark differences across age, race, ethnicity, Carlson Index, and PSA. Importantly, if you look at race in the RCTs, they were about 90% non-Hispanic white. compared to 68% in our EHRs. And they only had 1% of Hispanic Latinos in the RCT, as where we had about over 8%. So what we did is we took the model from this challenge, and they had over 101 variables included in their model. So we tried to apply that model to our EHRs, and we had very low accuracy, about 0.694. And what one of the main issues was, in addition to the demographics, is many of the variables they used were not collected in routine care. So these were like lesions of the liver, etc. And so we were able to use a feature optimization criteria to really reduce the number of variables that contributed to the prognosis of the patient. And so by using this strategy, we were able to decrease the 101 variables down to about 30 to get the optimal area under the curve of the prognostic model. So we then took this cohort from our EHRs and we wanted to look at patient experience. So we were able to find in our EHRs that these patients actually completed some treatment surveys, some patient-reported outcome surveys known as the PROMISE survey. And so we had patients, these were patients seeking chemotherapy. And so we were able to find surveys looking at pre-treatment, during treatment and post-treatment, and compare the patient experience. What we found, interestingly, was overall most patients did not change much between the pre and post-treatment. But during treatment, we saw very different trajectories of the patient patient-reported outcomes. Now, the first graph shows patient physical health, general health status, etc. And the second graph shows general mental health, depression, anxiety, etc. So by pulling in patient-reported outcomes, we were really able to identify different reactions to chemotherapy among these patients, which really helps identify information on the patient experience during treatment, which is often overlooked in most studies. So, lessons learned here. Randomized controlled trials often perform poorly in our EHRs, and we found that there were stark differences in demographics and also in the features used in the model. However, we were able to perform local model optimization to provide good discriminatory values. And it's important to think about the cost of features that are included in this model. And our feature reduction strategies were really beneficial to applying these models developed in the randomized control trial to our EHRs. We were able to include the patient experience data to better understand best treatment strategies. And this allows us also to assess bias and hence algorithmic fairness when we're thinking about applying these very narrow randomized clinical trials to a broader population. So in conclusion, we have developed a framework to use real-world data to generate real-world evidence for clinical assertions. When we pull our data together, we try and capture as much data, so we're not looking just at the structured data in the EHRs, but we also include the unstructured data, patient surveys, etc. We're also using advanced technologies, so we use natural language processing, machine learning, deep learning, etc., so that we can really leverage all the diverse information that's captured in the EHRs. We can then quickly and accurately identify inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials, which allows us to perform observational studies, pragmatic studies, and also to start thinking about historical and synthetic control arms for clinical trials. We're setting standards for using real-world data for clinical assertions. The cutoffs that I presented to you today are really open for discussion, but we're the first ones to really set out that there really needs to be a cutoff for how we're going to say that this is a good metric for clinical assertions. And so in the end, we use real-world data to guide discovery, development, and delivery of therapeutics, and it really helps augment the gold standard of the clinical trial. And so with that, I would like to thank my team. We have a very diverse team, including clinical investigators, methodological staff, postdoctoral fellows, medical students, graduate students, etc. And with that, I will leave you with my email and our website in case you have any additional questions you would like to ask. Thank you.
That was great. I think we're now going to start with our panel discussion. If Dr. Wang or Dr. Hamburg, if there is anything
I wanted to comment. Thanks to all the speakers. I think there were a lot of comments with Dr. Merchant's data for sure, and how we're being tracked. One of the questions, 2 points I'll make. One of the questions with regard to, like you do address, was, how eager or how easy is this to do in a research setting? My institution is 10 years behind the time, and so the IRB is very reticent about these kinds of, social media ascertainment of data. They just don't get it. And yet, Starbucks and Macy's knows exactly where you are and what you want to buy, and they ping you every day. And so they're just behind. So I'll leave that question. And then for Dr. Polwright, I added something in to the chat box. We have a citizen scientist program with our CTSI where we actually embed citizen scientists into research projects as co-investigators. And we have a curriculum that is agnostic to site. So that's a resource if anybody is interested in developing that type of program. So that link is in there. So I'll start with Dr. Merchant. Can you sort of talk about what the flavor around the world institutions is?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I really enjoyed all of the presentations from the speakers. I think about this in sort of two different buckets. So one are the population level studies that are emerging that look at publicly available data. So that would be information that's posted, let's say, on Twitter or threads on Reddit. And so there are a lot of studies which have used this more population level data. I say that our approach is to try to be patient-centered with all of our research, and to the extent possible to make sure that the approaches are very sort of like publicly available. If we are looking at data from a Reddit thread, we contact the organizer of the Reddit to get their input and find a way to share this information with the people on the thread and make sure that we're getting their feedback before sort of proceeding with that research. For the individualized data, so our group has been doing this for maybe almost 8 years, and we've been collecting data from individual patients, which we consent to access all of their social media data and their health record data. And so, we view this data as like incredibly sort of private, and we use the same protections of the social media data that we do for their health record data, because our understanding is that there's so much that is embedded in that social media data that we aren't even aware of, that tells us about people's health, their future health, their past health. And so we both collect, consent, store that data in the same way that we do sort of HIPAA data because of that. We also go through great lengths to make sure that we're consenting patients about the data that we're collecting, giving them lots of opportunities to decide to unshare at any time point, and then also creating ways to give people feedback and information about the data that we're collecting. We look at this primarily in aggregate, so we aren't looking at individuals sort of posts, but really trying to do this in a very sort of patient-centered ways. And one of the grant I have right now, an R1 from NHLBI, is specifically looking at how to the ways in which we can collect this data for understanding more about cardiovascular risk. And we worked really closely with our IRB. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this offline, but we've been working really closely with our IRB in trying to make sure that we're protecting this data, that we're being transparent with patients, that we're having dialogues with patients about the data and the potential sort of information that it holds. And so we've worked really closely, as I said, with our IRB on this process, and they've been incredible thought leaders. And then also talking to my program officer at NHLBI sort of about these issues has been really sort of helpful as well. But I'm happy if anybody has questions about sort of the IRB or consent process or the way that we've we've gone about that. We have about 6,000 patients right now in our data repository who've shared access to all of those different data sources with us.
Raina, sorry, can you talk a little bit more about the consent process here? Because I imagine it's a little different from a consent for a traditional trial.
Well, we think of them in a somewhat similar way in that we consent patients, and we do, depending, in COVID, this is mostly remote, but in non-COVID, it's both in person and online. But we give people information about all the different data that we are collecting. So every single field that we're collecting from their digital data. And then we also provide them with information about if they decide they no longer want to share that data, how they can opt out and we discard that data. So even if it was already sort of shared, they could at any time come back and say, you know what, those data I shared about my Google searches, because we also collect that from some patients, I actually don't want to share that. We have a way for them to sort of no longer share that. We do paper consents, and then we email them the consents as well, so they have it to be able to go back and review and look at any time. And then we provide the usual information for, look, if you have questions about this later, you want to talk to me, the PI, you can directly reach out to me to ask me questions about the data and sort of our uses of it in your specific data.
This has been really this is like the cutting edge part of doing research here, and I can actually imagine scenarios where our speakers would all talk to each other as well to sort of figure out how do you use social media to figure out patient-centered outcomes and to figure out, clinical trial recruitment strategies to enhance diversity. I mean, there's just so much to go for here. Let's see, I think there are some questions in the chat box related in part to access to sort of data that are out there. Maybe this is a question that, Raina, you can also tackle here.
All right, let me find the exact question in the chat.
Oh, it's just how do you access phone or social media data?
So it's different with every single platform. So it really varies. So with I'll just run through sort of a couple of the platforms, and they all have very specific terms of use. And so you, just because the data is there doesn't mean that you can just scrape it. You have to really be sure to follow this explicit terms of use. So for Twitter data, it is primarily publicly available. And so there are ways in which you can collect the data using Twitter's API. For Facebook data, a lot of it is private. And so we're consenting individuals to collect their individual data. We don't collect the data of others who are friends with those people. So only their specific data. So we've been very sort of explicit about that. For Reddit, again, publicly available, but there are ways to actually talk to people who are posting on Reddit to consent them or ask them about accessing their data. Instagram data, also there are limitations, although it's there, just being able to, you can't just sort of collect it and store it, but you can ask individuals about sharing their data. And then for the mobile phone data, there are a couple different platforms out there that you can consent people to download onto their phone that allows you to collect a lot of information about their screen time, their accelerometer, some of their location data. So it really, there's a lot of variability by platform in terms of the data you can collect.
I have a question for Gail. Gail, I think one of the things that has happened in COVID-19 is that we've at least attempted to move science at a rate of speed well beyond what we had ever seen. And I guess my question is this going to be the new standard, or when this sort of goes back to like a sort of something like normal, are we going to slow down again? Or have we set a bar, because we've seen, standing up trials from requesting a protocol development committee to get together. I'm talking active 4B because we're involved in that effort, basically from May to October to have a full protocol written, very complicated, aspects of that trial and starting to enroll. And that's unheard of in clinical trial land. I mean, usually, just getting the protocol together is a year and a half. And so do you think that we've changed the dynamic for clinical trials, both at the NHLBI industry or in general?
Well, to some extent, I hope so. If it's an important scientific question and it takes you a year and a half to write the protocol and another 7 years to recruit, is it still an important scientific question at the end of that time? On the other hand, I think it's not probably reasonable for NIH to expect that people are going to put the entire rest of their lives on hold to perform at this pace the way everyone who's involved in this has done. We not only putting together protocols, but assembling protocol review committees and data and safety monitoring boards, which are meeting in some cases monthly instead of the usual twice a year. That probably is not reasonable, but somewhere in between might be helpful. And accompanied by the same sort of community engagement alliance activities that we talked about, and with the recognition that I think I saw one of the questions go by in the chat box, how do you recruit women and members of underrepresented minorities? Well, one way is to have people in those groups leading the studies. So I hope we're going to think more about that. And then I think there are a lot of ways to make trials more efficient from start to finish, from planning to publication, through the digital techniques that Raina mentioned. I'm hoping we're going to involve patients more, as Megan talked about. So I think we have the opportunity to crystallize a whole new paradigm of how we think about clinical research. Somebody mentioned yesterday that, and we've heard this, the standard is to recruit 0.4 patients per site per month in heart failure trials. Well, I can tell you in the Pediatric Heart Network, we did better than that recruiting newborns with hypoplastic left heart syndrome into trials at some centers. So we don't think 0.4 patients per site per month is even remotely an acceptable metric. So for all of those reasons, I'm hoping the answer is yes, that we're going to change how we think about this. Be the change you want to see. That's what I want to do.
Don't set low bars. Megan, I think you had a question.
I have a basic question for Dr. Pearson that is for me and also I think for a lot of the audience. Can you help us understand a little bit more about the relationship between someone who's thinking about applying for a grant and the grant officer? Raina mentioned her relationship. I think for a lot of us, it's kind of mysterious about what we can ask. I know you said call us, but what should we come to that call with? How should we be prepared and what can we expect back?
That's a great question. So the most helpful thing, we seldom get cold calls anymore, but we get cold emails. And the most helpful thing is when someone says, hi, here's who I am. Here's a one-page summary of my specific aims. I'd like to talk to you about this. And this is perfect. And so if I get this, I'm not always the right person even, but I will know who the right person is. And then we set up a time to talk with them on the phone. And sometimes that involves more than one person from my team, depending on what's involved and what the question is. And we try to help them understand the process of applying for a trial. This applies to any grant, but we're talking about trials here. The process of applying for a trial, what the potential mechanisms are, funding mechanisms are to do that, what to expect, how to think about various aspects of this. And so you can ask us anything. I think I've gotten more than one email from somebody who said, my advisor told me I shouldn't talk to you. And that's the wrong approach. Any exchange that's had between You and me, Megan, if we're going to talk about a grant for you, that doesn't affect peer review at all. It doesn't affect the funding decisions at all. I will say, where it could affect funding decisions, sometimes we have the opportunity to select grants beyond the pay line. And so if you're a person who is belligerent or disrespectful or Rena, you're frowning like this never happens, I can assure you.
That sounds hard.
It does happen. Then, we have lots of people we can help, and maybe we won't want to help you. So, but otherwise, any question is fair game, truly.
Can I just add that just 3 examples from recent interactions I've had with program officers. One, I was submitting a K-24 in the midst of COVID while pandemic parenting and just totally frazzled. And I talked to the program officer, and she had this completely sort of novel way of thinking about mentorship that I could include in there that just was this aha moment. And it was amazing to talk to her. The second example is I was submitting a grant, and the program officer said, actually, I think this is better for this particular RFA that wasn't even on my horizon. And so it was like so helpful because I read that other one. I said, oh, this is what I actually targeted. And then the third example was just recently, I was talking to a program officer, and they said, did you know about this other person in your own institution who would be an incredible collaborator? And I had no idea. And so I connected with that person. We were able to collaborate on putting on this grant, and they had all of these sort of resources that were so complementary at the same institution. So I had to talk to the program officer to find somebody who was right next door. But I think the examples are endless, but the program officers are just so helpful. And so I can't sort of underscore that enough.
I've actually already responded to a member of the group here today who emailed me yesterday, and I've already connected them with the right person.
Tina, thanks for joining the meeting. I know your schedule today was very inflexible, so really thanks for being here to take some questions. I think one of the questions I had for you on behalf of the group was, how easy is it to blend real-world data into clinical trials research? So, thinking about how to take real-world data and maybe even reduce data collection burden, or being able to do corollary types of studies or things like that. Do you think you could comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, and so, I think that working with real world data is challenging given the issues with the data noise. I mean, really, when you think about the clinical trial data, it is the gold standard. I mean, you have people collecting that data, ensuring the quality of the data, ensuring the follow-up of the data. And in our real world data, we don't have that. So one of the biggest challenges we have in merging those data is to ensure that we have correct and accurate data that can augment the clinical trial. And regarding the merging of the data, it's taken us a long time to build the framework we have. And I think one of the things that's important is it really requires a multidisciplinary team, right? We have computer scientists working with our IT people, working with our database managers, because it really is a very complex experience to pull all that data together. However, once you do pull it together, you really have a gold mine. So, we've been working on pulling this information together. So now we have people coming to us saying, I've got this clinical trial. These are my inclusion exclusion criteria. Can you tell me how many patients in our institute meet these criteria? Can you tell me how many I lose if I add this criteria or add this exclusion? So it really helps you think about the cohort identification and how we can augment that process and speed up that process.
So we're at the end of our allotted time. Unfortunately, it's 12:30. I think everybody gets 5 minutes for a bio break. Minnow's being kind, so go quick.
5 minutes.
And we're expecting everybody back at 12:35.
Great.
That was a phenomenal session.
Thanks for a fantastic session, really. Roseanne, I think you're on. And everyone, I hope you noticed that you got an extra 1 minute for your bio break, so that's excellent. I'm going to turn this over to Roseanne Nelson, and I want to introduce Roseanne as the leader of our leadership development program at ACC. And those of you who have gone through one of the leadership cohorts will know her well, and her constant help with your career and leadership opportunities, and also her prodding to get things done. She's very good at that. So Roseanne, I'm going to turn it over to you for our career planning session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Walsh. So first, can you all see me and hear me? One thumb, just one thumb up, and I'll be comfortable.
Yes, yes, we can.
A thumb and a voice. Okay, great. So for those of you I know, it's good to see you and hear you eventually. For those of you that I don't know, as Dr. Walsh said, I am part of the team that runs the leadership development for the members at ACC. And I've been with ACC now for almost 7 years, which is incredible. It's gone by very quickly. But we've also had a lot of fun, and I have a lot of fun doing what I do, which I think lends itself to 7 years going very quickly. But just by voice, can you all tell me if you did the pre-work? Just a few yeses or nos. I'm looking at. Let me see.
Yes. Yes.
That's a yes. That's a resounding yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. I bet Shashank did it. Okay, and I know Craig did it. Okay. So let me see if I can get the screen moving. Bear with me here. So the first thing I like to address, thanks Shashank. The first thing I like to address is our expectations. And you know, somewhere along the way, when we were very little, I think, we were all sort of raised to believe that the expectations of our career path will be fairly linear, right? We go through life from A to B to C to D, and it's a linear path. And, you know, we get this way with school where we get an A and we go forward to the next piece. And, you know, we've always heard the term, the ladder, the career ladder, just keep climbing, keep going. As if to say, if you do this, then that will occur, and that will undoubtedly always occur. But the reality, as we all know, is it's no longer this linear path. It's not the ladder. It's actually a jungle gym. And if it's not a jungle gym, if you're not sort of climbing and falling and shifting and pivoting, then most likely you're not learning and you're not evolving. And I would hedge my bet that for those that have, let's say, been in the workplace for 40 odd years, really just sort of staying that linear line without a whole lot of change or disruption, I'm not so sure that they're reaching their full potential. I would hedge that. I don't know, but I would hedge it, right? We spend about 1/3 of our life in the workplace. And so, you know, the goal isn't just to come in clock out. In a nutshell, it's actually much more than that. And, you know, I'm a firm believer in, and I've taught my kids this, you know, you got to do what you love and love what you do. And if you don't, then there are bigger issues at play. Speaking of the kids, they are home and they may run in, but if they do run in, they know what to say. Do what you love and love what you do. So quick hands or voice. Anyone see the pre-work video?
I did, yes.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Jill. Yes. Thank you. Okay. So the video itself was really just to give you guys a sense of why the pre-work was assigned. And the importance of it. But for those that didn't get a chance, I do want to spend a little time on the why behind this. You know, in organizations, we have seen this time and again. Organizations pull in people like me, they pull in consultants, they spend tens of thousands of dollars just to determine their mission, their vision, their values. What is our reason for being? What do we stand for? Where are we going? Where have we been? and you know, sort of the why behind why we exist. What we don't do is, as individuals, we actually don't do the same exercise. And I don't know why we don't, but we don't. So organizations do it, and we all sort of adapt inward to the mission and the vision and the values of an organization. You're quick, if you go in an interview, you'll say, well, what are the values here? What is it that you believe in? What are the norms? What can I expect? But as an individual, when we go through that career trajectory, that mission, vision, values should be fairly almost like the nucleus, right? And so when we think about this jungle gym piece of a career, right? Forget the linear piece, forget the A to Z, forget the predictability. When we focus on all the things in life that are going to change and shift over the span of one's career, what shouldn't shift a whole lot is the why, is the mission and the vision and the values. So for you as an individual. So I push this exercise out, and I'll tell you why it's important, but I'm curious to know from you all. I'm going to push this back to you guys. I'm going to pick on a few likely souls here. Shashank, why is this exercise so important, and have you done this prior to this session?
Yes, I have done this in the Leadership Academy.
Okay, you were the wrong person to ask. So if you didn't do the Leadership Academy, would you have done this?
Probably not, but I found it to be extremely effective in getting clarity on obviously your mission and your vision. And so being able to say no to the things and the opportunities that we're fortunate to attract, I think is a large reason why I found it very helpful.
Great, thank you, Shashank. Jill Steiner, I'm going to call on you. Why do you think the exercise that I pushed out to you all is important at this very moment?
Hi, Roseanne. Thanks for doing this. Hi. I think it's important for a number of reasons. At this very moment, as we're asking questions and receiving advice about how to move forward in our careers, I think it's important to understand what is important to us and what is important to our fields as we move forward, and find some agreement or disagreement between them. And I think thinking about this mission vision exercise really helps some of us, including myself, critically analyze how we feel about a lot of these things, and also what resources we need to move forward, because everyone's experience is not going to be the same. You can tell from the chats already that the questions people are asking do not always apply to everyone, and we need to figure out what we really need to move forward.
And Jill, while I have you, do you think this year 2020 has changed anything in that vein in terms of COVID and how we are working differently? And talk about a pivot. How has 2020 impacted this for you?
I think it's even more important to know who you are and know when to ask for help and what to ask and who to ask, because you're less likely to run into people in the hall. I think we're all feeling pretty isolated and have to be more deliberate in reaching out. And we want to make sure that we are reaching out effectively and respectfully and with clear intention.
Okay, I like that. I'm trying to go back to the previous slide. So I don't know if Jacob, you control it, but can you pull it back to stay on the why for a bit? Jill, thank you, because I think that's a very important point. I think, yes, the exercise is important, and on the best of days, like Shashank said, if you're in a leadership program and they push this out, you think, wow, I actually have never done this. This is important. I'm going to take a moment to do this. And in the best of days, that's a great, it's a great thought-provoking 50,000-foot view down on your career and where you want to go and who you want to be. But when you're in a moment of crisis, and especially 2020, because it's not a sort of a fixed event, it's not a finite event, it's an extensively long event, which really, pushes each of us to think about things a lot differently. As in, what do we really value? What we thought we might have valued in 2019 could very much have changed in 2020, and rightly so. So that's another reason why I pushed this out. Yes, it's an important exercise. No, most of us don't do it. It's incredibly, incredibly helpful to do it now while we're in the middle of this heightened state. I would also recommend in 21 or even 2022, when things have settled a bit, to come back to this. While it shouldn't shift a whole lot, remember this is sort of like your North Star, I would encourage you all to come back to this when life settles a tad and just see what's changed, what's shifted. All right, Jacob, I'm ready for the next bullet. I think there's probably another bullet under here, maybe a few. No. Okay, so let's go to the first bullet on the what. All right, so I'm going to pick on Craig. Craig, talk to me about this process for you. And we're going to get into this a bit in terms of what the document was, but talking about your personal mission, your vision and your values before we get into the document or anything else? Craig.
So you want, just to clarify, you want specifically what I had written and not describing specifically what went well during that process, or how do you want that to go?
I want to hear about the process. Like, was this uncomfortable? Was it easy?
Oh yeah,
was it
highly uncomfortable, and especially partly due to the fact of, I've done a little bit of this activity before, also kind of through Leadership Academy and some other pieces, but I hadn't actually sat down and done it since what you're alluding to, the pandemic started, and really reflecting in what where I am and those types of things. I think even though, and it's funny, independently doing this for myself, but also working with other organizations, a lot of times you may find your mission and vision overall may not change when you do these reflection exercises, but I think it's important to go through that exercise of doing it periodically to make sure that what has or has not changed. And you may see that it's the same concept or the same variation, or it doesn't change that dramatically, but I think it's important to do this. So my mission is to become a leader in cardiovascular pharmacotherapy through education and implementation in order to advance patient care. And that's kind of always been my mission to some degree. And so really sticking with that theme, and vision is to be a well-rounded cardiovascular clinician and researcher who investigates the optimization and implementation of cardiovascular pharmacotherapy. And, I value hard work, collaboration, and diversity through these efforts because it makes the whole process better, makes myself better, and it really brings things that I maybe hadn't thought about, or I'm a very outgoing, sociable person, so I like working with people or working in groups to solve problems, because I will be the first to tell you the strongest person in my life is usually not me, right? I mean, it's working with individuals and
No, I thought it was your wife, Craig. I thought that's where this was going.
Well, if you really look at our relationship, that is true. Like, so I think that's been the key to it. But what really went well is doing the process periodically over and over again. So having the ability or the thought to do it again. What doesn't go well is you're really trying to think through, and I think this time I did it at a different angle through the resource, and just what really doesn't go well is the emotion, the anxiety of, you're like, I really have a lot more than I think I need to do, or the steps or the planning that go into it. And I think that's what, not that doesn't go well, it's just you're like, you realize there's a lot more that you when you really get into the finite details, you're like, these are things that I really need to focus on or work towards, or you reflect that I'm a little behind on this. I think that's the part where you're like, okay, I need to get it in gear. So
hold on here. Okay, so hold on. I'm trying to get the slide back a couple pages. Jacob, I do not have control here. So Craig, that is a very good point. And I think part of the process is, thanks, Jacob. Let's leave it here for a second. Part of the problem with this is, again, it goes back to our sense of, well, it's a bit of a control, right? We do think if we do X and we do Y, then we will get to a certain point. But again, life doesn't happen that way, and our career doesn't happen that way. And we don't actually necessarily want it to go that way. And there are a number of people within this room, as in not in Fairfax, but on this call, that have taken slight left turns and slight right turns that I've gotten to know over the years that maybe we didn't know would go the way it went, but in the end, it's actually worked out better than the initial plan. And so when we get to the closing, I'll talk a little bit about serendipity, but while we want all this on paper, and I want you guys to hold on to this and revisit this and think through it and have some discomfort, I want you to also allow to just sort of let go of the control a bit and allow for serendipity. Those that you meet within the CTR network, those that you meet within ACC, continue to reach out. I was listening a little bit before I jumped on, and there was a comment regarding, I don't recall who said it, but it was, so-and-so reached out to me via email, and the first line was, I was told not to reach out to you, but I want you guys to lean into reach out. The people in this room and on this call want to hear from you, myself included. So if you're ever at a point where you think, I don't feel comfortable reaching out, or I should not, I want you to think about the why behind that. Reach out. Once you get out of this linear framework of what you should and shouldn't do, your career tends to expand in ways we do not anticipate. So I want to talk about any of the surprises during this uncomfortable process. And I'm going to call on somebody I don't actually know. How about RT Dalal? Where are you? Are you with us?
Hi. Can you see me?
I don't, but I hear you, and you have a great voice. There you are. Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am great, thank you. So, Artie, we don't know each other. I don't know your background. I don't know anything about you. I want to know, though, was this easy for you? What surprised you in the end?
It wasn't easy, mostly because I hadn't done it before. What I liked about it was that it sort of forced me to think about how the things that we're sort of learning over these past 2 days, making sure that they do align with where I sort of see myself in 5 years. And it's interesting. So my background is I'm not a heavy researcher. It is something that I want to get better at, which is why I wanted to do this. And then sort of thinking about what my end goal was, it was helpful to sort of see that this is actually an important building block for me. And so as I'm thinking about, right, so, and what I also found a little bit challenging was sort of splitting the difference between your mission and your vision. Often I sort of combine those two things, but understanding how, well, this is what I want to do, and this is what I see myself doing, and how do you sort of marry those two ideas? And then what I guess you asked what I found surprising. So when I thought about the things, as I sort of was putting that together, even though I didn't realize it, a lot of the things that I have been able to do and sort of put together have almost like organically led me to where I am, which was really nice. So like that story, I think someone had said, when you're whether you're applying for a grant or you're writing a grant, like telling that story. And so if you like sort of take that, 10,000 feet view, there is a story that ends up playing, even though you don't realize it, if you sort of follow the passion that you have.
Yes, and one day, and this is somebody that I've worked with for quite a while and has spoken at Leadership Academy over the years. Dr. Ichaporia has often said, Artie, the dots, right? These are dots along the way. We have all these little data points along the way of our life. And you look back over the 20 years and you start to see that story, right? You start to see the threading and you start to see why does this make sense now as we look back? But we can't really see the story, of course, until we go into hindsight. And the same will be true for 2020, which is why I say, there should be some disruption, right? There should be some surprise in this effort. This shouldn't be an easy exercise. Craig shouldn't have been able to just wake up one day and do this, right? It should be hard, for good reason, because you want this to be, you like anything in life. If it's easy, then there might be something a little bit, stretch and push yourself. And especially for those of you that are in this program, there's a reason you're dedicating 2 days to be in this program, especially online. This is a lot, right? So to be here, there's something within you that says, you know what, I either want to go deep into this area or I need to take a left turn and figure out who I need to work with to get deeper. That's a shift, right? That's a shift. And that's a great place to be, which is why this module is at the end of your 2 days. So I want to ask one more question of one more kind soul, and this will be Ajith, I believe. Ajith, where are you? Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm right here.
I'm like a DJ over here. Where are you? Okay. What, Ajith, will you do differently going forward? Did anything come out to you that, and I'm talking specifically in juxtaposition with what you've learned over the last couple of days, is there anything you might shift and change now that you've done this exercise? Anything you put there, but now you're like, well, you know what? I actually need to do a little bit different.
No, I think certainly these last 2 days have been, quite informative, and it's actually been a period of self-reflection, and I think one thing that you get out of it is, to thy own self be true, and this exercise specifically with our mission values and their vision, has lent itself to that, and just being very granular about, what are our steps that we need to take really puts our whole, sort of career in sort of like you said, 30,000 feet above ground vision as far as where we want to go. And then it really, brings up what we value. And I think with me personally, I would say that, I'm very clinically busy. I do enjoy the clinical aspects of care quite a bit because that's what motivates, sort of research thoughts actually. And to balance that appropriately is probably one of the things that, really comes up with, making these lists, coming up with goals. And then, it can be sometimes overwhelming to say, okay, these are what I want to accomplish. And how in the world am I going to accomplish by balancing like 3 or 4 different major aspects of my life, from clinical life and, research aspects. But it's great to know that, there's a wide, variety of people here that come from, sort of, modest research backgrounds like myself to, those who are extremely accomplished. And so it's great to get that full breadth.
I think that's wonderful. Dr. Douglas just chimed in, and I want to address this very quickly and then move to the next, but I'm not ready, Jacob, to move to the next. So hold the slide. But Dr. Douglas says, I don't know about the other faculty, but my career has had some pretty dramatic twists and turns, ending in a great place now. I would love for Dr. Douglas to speak to this a bit in terms of what did you expect when you started out, and where have you landed, and why is it so great?
Thanks, Roseanne. Happy to share with everybody. I started out thinking that I wanted to do clinical research in cardiology, and I have. So in many ways, whatever happened in the twists and turns came back around to that really core fundamental, which never quite went away, but went away to a fair bit. So as I started out in my first job, I became uncomfortable in that job and in the lab I was working in, and so and very immodestly thought that I could run an echo lab better than this lab was being run. And so I went off to go run my echo lab better. And then in the process of doing that, became a little bit more known and started getting involved in professional societies. And then was in an institution that was very challenged financially and not able really to see its way forward, and felt that that was dragging me down. So very circumstantial reaction to me. And I went off to become chief of cardiology at University of Wisconsin, but also simultaneously became president of the American Society of Echocardiography. And then 18 months after that, president of ACC. And in the middle of that, I moved to Duke as chief, being a larger, more prestigious university with more opportunities, interestingly enough, for clinical research, of which I was doing almost none at that point, since I had 2 full-time jobs, one as administrative job as chief and another leading societies. And then after about 7.5 years of chiefdom and presidencies and so on, enough was enough. And I got rid of all of that and went back and became a clinical scientist again, and started working from the ground up to get NIH studies and so on. And I'm delighted now that that is what I'm doing. I've been fully funded for over 10, 12 years. And I'm doing the research that I always wanted to do, but I don't know, there's a long way around to get to it, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's serendipity to it. I mean, I think that we can plan for only so much. I always say if a door opens, to put a toe through the door, like walk through a bit, try it on. If it doesn't feel right, you can back, but go forward. A question came in about, how do I make a shift? Let me see where this is. I think it's a little bit above, but how do I make a shift toward a direction that I'm passionate about? I don't know, I can't see it anymore. When it seems overwhelming. Okay, my advice to this, and I'll push this to the panel as well, but my initial response to this is very, very, very small micro steps. And that's why in the mission, vision, values sheet that you all have, I force you all gently to look 5 years out, or sort of a longer term goal, but that really doesn't do much unless you put in these short term goals. And in concert with that, you need an accountability buddy. And I would encourage you all to sync up with somebody from this program to make sure that you have that. Check in a month, and then in 90 days, and then in 120 days. and see if you've made this one small change. You don't have to boil the ocean. Shashank is a great example. He just started to say no after he figured out the vision he wanted to go in. Does this align with my values? If not, no. So at some point along the way, you have to sort of figure out your key motivator and get these tiny little micro steps to support the movement. It's overwhelming because it feels like you have to do this overnight per chat, but it can't be done overnight. It is a long and lengthy jungle gym of a career path. So Jacob, I want to go to the next slide. And this might help as we talk about this a little bit more. This is Dr. Eccles. As we talk about this a little bit more, when we're talking about a 5-year career plan, and I had you all do the mission, vision, values, there are a couple things I really want you all to consider. Now, for those of you that have done this pre-session, I want you to kind of go back and look and see, does this all sync up? But for those of you that haven't, I intentionally did not share it in advance because I really want you to think like, now that you've gone through these 2 days of CTR with your colleagues and leaders, what has changed and what on that sheet might change and what do you need to change to get there? So in other words, start with the end in mind. I always want folks to go a little bit ahead, not too far, but just enough. Okay, so in May of 2026, for example, what do you want your CTR career to look like? What is that? What's your vision? What's the big lofty vision? Where do you see yourself? But also, what do you hope to accomplish? What are some of the action items? And again, this doesn't need to be all the things, but it needs to be a couple things. The short-term goals are what will keep you on track. And I think those are almost more important than the long-term. But the short-term goals will ensure that you all stay on track, but also distinctly linked up with really where you want to go. But I really encourage an accountability buddy, and I would reach out within Member Hub or reach out to Stephanie Mitchell or myself, and we can help you find somebody to partner up with because each of you is in this program for a reason, and you want to be in this line of work and this area of expertise. So make sure you're not doing this alone. It'll push you forward. The learning plan is very important because it's not just about didactic learning. I want you all to consider what are the areas that you need to sort of dig in a little bit. So this could be networking. So are you surrounding yourself with those that potentially work in the space that you think you want to be? And do you have clarity regarding what their actual day looks like? What are their stressors? What is exciting? What is energy depleting? Do they have balance in their life? Are they're where they thought they wanted to be? Is it still the right place for them? You almost want to get you're almost like an investigator, no pun intended, to sort of figure out what this world looks like once you get there before you get there so that you can really know what you need. A learning plan is important, but the network is also equally important. And I want you to think about what might change between now and let's say 2026, right? Your personal life, your professional life, unexpected course corrections and so forth. We tend to ignore that. And I don't know why, I do it myself, but it will not be a smooth sailing, right? Things will happen. So think about that. And the good things and not so good things will occur. And how do you course correct for that? Accountabilities, and then finally pay it forward. I would encourage you all to select a colleague that is at your institution or within your world that has ambitions, whether it's in clinical research, clinical trials research, or a different area of focus. Pull them along, carry them forward, be that sort of propelling agent for them. Part of doing that is you become part of this process and you share the journey with somebody else, but it also forces you to be pretty honest about what you're doing in your own career. So I will say that's an equally important part of this process. Can we go one more slide ahead so I can see what's going on, Jacob? Okay, before we go to closing thoughts. Okay. Well, thanks. It's like having a magician behind the scenes. I want to talk a little bit about serendipity because I think it's equally important. I know my time with you is brief, and what you have for pre-work is a few sheets of paper, but there's an area within the document that I highlighted in the pre-video, but I really want to make sure you guys spend time on. It's the values piece. I'm gonna tap into Shashank for this piece because I know he and I are pretty well in sync with this, but I want to ask Shashank, from a values perspective, what are the most important values in a workplace for you?
Sure. So I think honesty and integrity, compassion and passion. and then growth and contribution and collaboration. I think those were the ones that I highlighted.
So thank you, Shashank. That was great. So when we talk about values, this is something that we often don't think about in our careers. We think we go into an interview, let's say at a basic level, we go into interview for a role that we think we would love. We ask about all the technical components of the role, the job, who we report to, who we're leading, maybe if we have a team. What we don't ask about is what is it like to be here all day? Who am I working with? What's the culture here? Is it competitive? Is it collaborative? Will I move around or up quickly? Or will it be a slow and steady rise that we're all in this together? There's a cultural component that within our careers that we do not address enough. And I did a presentation with the program directors. I think it was probably, well, I mean, it feels like a decade ago because 2020 is so long, but it must have been last year. And we talked about the values piece, and I was standing there in a room full of probably 40 program directors, and they were just stumped. They were stumped. Where do I find the values? Well, how do I know what the values are? What do I do if I can't find them? Right? Values are funny. They're intrinsic and extrinsic, right? The extrinsic value, we know, right? How much are you going to pay me? How much of a bonus am I going to get? And what's sort of the transactional role? I have until 1:20. Thank you. What are the transactional roles that I need to accomplish in this capacity, right? These are like the technical components of a job. But the intrinsic value, the intrinsic pieces to this, right? Shashank spoke of it, right? For him, it's very important that he's in an environment of authenticity and trust and transparency. And because I know Shashank, I can say that. For me, what's important? I need flexibility. I need affirmation. I need a team that's all in. I need collaboration versus competition, right? I know these are the things I need. And if I don't get them, then the job could be perfect. But if the environment is not, I'm probably not going to be particularly happy in the long run. So I want you to think through mission, vision, important, but values. Where are you in 5 years? With whom are you working? What is the environment like? Are you independent? Are you within a team? Is it flexible? Is it competitive? Is it collaborative? Right? What does the balance look like? Those are very, very important pieces to the puzzle. Again, we spend a third of our life in the workplace. You got to make sure that the values piece is front and center. That is the culture of the environment that you are working in, and it should be healthy. And if it's not a healthy culture, you got to ask yourself, is it worth it? Okay. So let's go to closing thoughts. Let's go to the top bullet, Jacob, and see. Let's do all the. I think there are probably 3 bullets. So let me check in with Jill. Jill, I'm curious to know, after these 2 days, what will you do differently now? In other words, did you determine additional skills that you may not have already had within that document that you now need or will look into?
Yes, actually, I really liked that part of the exercise, thinking about what skills I'll need and breaking down some of the goals. So I thought a little bit about what sort of further leadership development skills I might need and how I was planning on building on things I'm already involved in to get them. And then just, we spoke a lot about some of the different methodologies and some of the statistical considerations in clinical trials research. And so I gained some clarity on what I will need to look into and learn more about for myself. I think those are 2 of the big ones.
Jill, can I ask you, are the additional skills, are they more technical or are they more sort of leadership focused for you? Curious.
I think they're both. A lot of it is still out in my first year after fellowship, trying to figure out how I will need to lead and what my presence will be ideally in different situations and how I want to comport myself. But some of them are hard skills that there's not enough time to learn everything before getting to this point. And so how am I going to use the time that I do have moving forward?
And in terms of changes and adjustments, this is kind of a cool question. What we've sort of talked about it, but what changes, adjustments now might you make, like immediately within the next 10 days? What might you do differently after going through this program and after doing this exercise? I'm curious, like this one specific thing.
There have been a few people I've been meaning to reach out to, and I found lots of internal excuses not to do that. And so my first step is to finally do that, using this as an impetus to do it.
That's awesome. And use the member hub. And of course, you know me, so reach out to me. But anybody within this group, reach out to me, reach out to Stephanie. We'll connect you. But this is an important piece of it, the networking, right? You want to get a sense of where you're going before you get there. The best way to do that is really just to chat with people and ask and see what, most likely, if you had this one question, the rest of the group majority of the group has a similar question. I want to ask one more, this final leveraging connections. Craig, I want to hear from you. What are you going to do in this regard?
Sorry, I think I agree with the connection is, and this is when I made my strategic plan or looked at my mission vision statement, is to, when I looked at my, deficits, and then obviously the key asterisk here is hearing some of these conversations today is like, okay, there are people I want to reach out to, ask questions, or I have more need for. I think one of the biggest things that I've really been struggling with is finding mentors related to what I want to do at my local institution. And so part of that is, having the connections to reach out to individuals that align with what I want to do, or may have more expertise or an experience than individuals that I currently have that don't have that experience where I'm at. So I think that's my next steps. And really, if you looked at my plan, it's like littered with that type of commentary, like need to network or mentor with someone that can help me do this. And I think I've alluded, I feel like being that I'm not a physician, at a slight different disadvantage. So I have to, talk in framework how to get through that from being a pharmacist perspective in that aspect. So I think it's really a fact finding to get me to the next step. As I've alluded to, I'm halfway through a PhD program. I've had to rechange my direction because the original project I wasn't thrilled about, and the next project I chose, I have people that are very supportive of me, but they're not as familiar with some of the things that I want to do, and so trying to find people to connect with to help solve that. So
awesome. One more. I have 7 minutes, so I'm gonna use them carefully. Do I have one more bullet, Jacob, or does it go to the final slide? And then one more. Okay. So who you carry forward? Okay, I want to talk about a couple things real quick before I leave you all. The first is this piece on serendipity, and Dr. Douglas mentioned this, but I'm going to mention it as well. A number of you know this. When I came to ACC, my background is completely corporate. I've grown up, I'm mid-40s. I spent the last 20 years studying organizational development, leadership development, executive coaching. My roles have always been in a corporate environment. I came to ACC to do this for staff in 2014, primarily to do this. There was no discussion on membership. I didn't even know how to spell cardiology. I just wanted to do this for the staff. At that point, we probably had 400, 300 people. I was very excited. I was really, really excited about standing up an internal structure for organizational development. Serendipity hit about 6 months in when I heard about some help needed for Leadership Academy and this, that, and the other. I'll make it short, but I will say to you that at that point, in the very start of 2014, I was faced with a decision. Which direction will I take? Well, it was probably 2015 at that point. And there was a fork in the road. I could either stay within HR and do what I've always done and do it well, but it's very comfortable, or I could go over and switch to the other side and take this opportunity to do something that's really uncomfortable. Keeping in mind, still have 2 young kids at home, a commute, the whole thing. I had so many derailers in my mind that I could say, no, I'm just going to stay and go steady state. And I actually talked to my father about this, and he said, why are you losing sleep? Why is this decision not made? Why are you not taking the risk? And I gave all the reasons. And he said, what happens if you go and you fail? And I said, I actually had never thought about that. I don't know. And he said, what happens if you go and you succeed? And what happens if you go and you love it? And in the end, I made a decision that was uncomfortable for me. I made the decision to leave my home of HR and go somewhere completely different within this organization. And I say that to you because while the experience around me and the environment basically changed dramatically, my core values, my mission, and my vision stayed true. I'm still doing what I love every single day. I'm just doing it in a different way. And so that's what I really want you to think about. Hold tight to this document, your mission, your vision, your values, and hold on to it. It's your own personal roadmap. So lean on it. So I have, I think, 5 minutes for questions, and I'm open to answering anything and everything. So who do we have? I'm looking at chat. You can chat or you can chime in. Can you comment on the role of professional coaching? Yes, professional coaching does have a place in terms of, does it have a place in terms of helping us develop a strategic plan, holding us accountable? Yes. Can anyone comment on their personal experience? I will say one thing about that, and then I will push it out to the crowd. Professional coaching is great. You can find any number of professional coaches. The key with coaching or any of the stuff sort of in my world is mentor included. They could be the most brilliant person in the room, but if you don't have a connection with them, it's probably not worth your time in terms of your time and money investment. So whoever you find, make sure there's a connection there. And if you're looking for a certification, there's a certification for coaching you could look out for, but and I can talk to you about that. But primarily, you're looking for somebody who understands you and can help you, but speaks your language as well. Anyone want to address that piece? With 4 minutes.
Yeah, this is Tracy. I can speak to coaching. I've done some. I've sought coaching before. I think of coaching as basically taking a course. You've got to have a set of learning objectives from that course. And it's time specified. Once you've reached those goals, the coaching relationship should come to a close. And the coaching experience is really just figuring out what is in the toolbox to help you grow. And a lot of people mistake coaching as sort of like a therapist that that's objective outside. That's not really what a coach is. And I did make that mistake early on. It was sort of my kvetching session for a while, but that really wasn't a great use of that relationship. But through the coaching thing, I ended up learning a lot about what's the sort of a conceptual framework for thinking through things or thinking about things. It also helped me set up a more mentorship, both senior mentorship, internal, external, as well as more lateral mentorship relationships. And so I think this really just put me in a healthier state to move forward. So that was my coaching experience.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wang. Another question regarding, how would you suggest telling someone you don't agree with their advice? Do you end the relationship? And I'm assuming the someone in this capacity is a mentor. This goes back to my initial point. So only you know the direction you really want to go, and only you know your tolerance for change and risk and what values you need. If you can just hold steady to the core nucleus of your what's important to you career-wise in your professional world, if you have discomfort with the direction a mentor or a coach is saying, you got to listen to the discomfort. Like, yes, you should have your own discomfort, Shashank, good quote. But if it doesn't feel right coming from another person to you, you got to listen, to yourself. I've said this before when we do assessments with ACC, various team building assessments and whatnot. It's going to put you in a box, but if that box doesn't seem right to you, then listen to your voice. That's not the box for you. Always go back to this mission, vision, values, and hold on to it. Any other questions with our remaining and glamorous 60 seconds?
Thanks, Roseanne. Would you mind staying on for the next half hour?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. No, I'm happy to.
Thank you so much for that great session. And I know everybody who did the pre-work has really benefited from that. Why don't we all turn our cameras on now? What we're going to do for the next 30 minutes, actually, Jacob, could you share that one slide with the sticky notes on it? And what we're going to do is continue the discussion and kind of, for the next 30 minutes or so, wrap up this whole career planning exercise that you did. And we wanted to continue the dialogue either in the chat box or if you want to speak up. It might be a little chaotic, so don't everyone speak at once. But we wanted to show you how this evolved in person during our last meeting, which was a day-and-a-half long meeting. You're going to have this entire year for your cohort. But what we did was post on a sticky note, what's the first thing you'll do when you go home? And so people got busy and wrote everything. And then Pam, Tracy, and I, while they were doing another activity, wrote on the, we kind of collated these into piles as to commonalities. And so this is kind of what we want to spend this part of time to think with you on exactly this question. Where are you going to go from here? And to help us do that, we have a poll that I think we can now show now. It's a really brief poll, but we thought we'd just sort of take your temperature to see where you are in the questions are easy. Here you go. It's in the chat box, and you're going to have 5 minutes to fill this out. And there's no music, so you just hum to yourself.
You can hum Jeopardy.
No, that's too sad.
Oh no, that was too soon. Too soon.
Too sad.
I know, it's sad. I know. 2020. Oh.
Forget about the next 3 years. That's what I'm doing in the next 3 weeks.
Excellent. That counts.
Okay, 5 people are still working on it. So, Jacob, I think we'll close it at 3 minutes. We want to give you guys plenty of time to think it over. So we're gonna see the answers to the poll, and then we're also gonna tell you the commonalities that we saw on the pre-session survey that you sent in to us.
Ended. Okay.
Okay, do we have results?
I've never done this on WebEx, so this is
it's all new.
Yeah, it's all new. It's all flexibility.
Someone will have to project it.
Here we go.
There it is.
Interesting.
Can everybody see it? If you can't speak up.
No.
So in the bottom right, you have a lozenge that has participants, chat, and 3 dots. If you go to the 3 dots, there's an option for polling.
So what we found is, so I can't actually see the questions. Now I can see the answers. Oh, here it is. Among my top 3 career action items, I will write a grant in the next year. We got 40 yeses, 14 no's, and 15 people didn't answer. The next question, among my top 3 career action items, I will immediately complete unfinished manuscripts. 42 of 69 said yes, 11 of 69 said no. and 16, no response.
I want to know from those 11. That's when we were writing this question, Minnow and I went back and forth, and she said everybody's going to write, even the faculty, everybody's going to write.
I said everybody's going to say, I
we
have
should
unwritten.
include that. Okay, keep going.
Well, maybe if you haven't written a paper yet, maybe you don't have one to finish. Among my top 3 career action items are finding a new or additional mentor in the next year. 37 said yes, 14 said no, 18 didn't answer that one. The next one is I need to prepare for a promotion in the next 3 years. 31 said yes, 21 said no, 17 no answer. And the last one is I plan to negotiate my job description and or compensation in the next 3 years. 26 said yes, 24 said no, and 16 no answer. So interesting. Further on to that, what you said is in the pre-session survey, the top 5 recurring themes based on the number of mentions was number 1, time. And that included protected time, clinical volumes, and time management. That was mentioned greater than 60 times. Funding was number 2, mentioned 47 times. Mentorship was mentioned 3rd, 30 times, of which 11 times it was explicitly stated that the individual had a lack of mentorship. Number 4 was support, which was mentioned 16 times. And number 5, transition and leadership was mentioned 13 times. So that's what you said before, and this is what the poll is today. So let's open it up to further comments. Feel free to comment either in the chat or or if you want to kind of just shout out, as long as it doesn't get out of control, we can just hear from you.
So I would, this is Pam, I just want to comment a little bit looking at these side by side, because obviously the pre-questionnaire was and the poll today was not only after the career planning exercise, but also after hearing things for the last 2 days. A key to time management and protected time is getting stuff done, is prioritization. So I see those as very tightly related. Almost all of you, you're very selected to be here. Almost all of you have published and have papers in the pipeline. And so really critical that you complete what's almost done immediately. Funding, that's the grant. Or it may be the job description and compensation for that. Mentorship, we did talk a lot about the last 2 days, and some of it's very individual, but we can talk more about mentorship and support. And transition to leadership, I think covers many of these things. But I would urge you, those of you who are seeking to transition to leadership, is to think about how you're going to prepare to do that. And so not just preparing for a promotion, but preparing for a leadership role. So I see this as very interrelated. The pre-questionnaire might be the topics, but the polling that we did was the specific action item.
So, Pam, maybe you could, or if Ann Curtis is on, I don't know if she's on, because she would.
I'm here. What's the question?
Okay, great. Here's a question that maybe you could give us, because you did such a good job talking about how negotiating and things last night. Is there, Amanda wanted to know, is there any guidance on what frequency with which to readdress job description and compensation? Is it just when there's a major change in job title, funding, or with any interim frequency?
I wouldn't say that there's a standard frequency. As a matter of fact, if I had somebody showing up in my office every 2 or 3 years looking for more money, I don't know if it would go over very well. But I think productivity is just, frankly, it's a very important part. And so anytime somebody's very clinically active and their activity is out of whack with how they're being compensated, because some people are still not, some people are strict productivity, some people are not. So if that's not the case, if things have changed, if you've brought some value, you've gotten a grant, your job description has changed, or your clinical activity has changed a bit, I think it's worth having the discussion. And the place to start is usually going to be your direct supervisor. I have 200 faculty in my department of medicine. If they were all coming at me like that, it would be pretty rough. But they've got to go through the division chief, and then we have those discussions. I mean, no more than yearly for sure. And then I'd expect to see some. It's like any job that you're going to negotiate for a raise. What's your reason behind it? And certainly salary equity is not an unreasonable thing to think about, and it's something we all have to be cognizant of. But if it's not that kind of an issue, then it's got to be what you've accomplished that deserves a change.
I would have a slightly different take on it, Ann, and I think it's because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're talking about a wholesale, everything on the table kind of negotiation. I think you should have an annual meeting every year with some sort of supervisor person. So let me just say that, whether it's your lab director, your division chief, or whoever is the right person to have that, but you should have that career check-in meeting every year. And at that time, one of the things you should cover is the job description and the responsibilities and the salary all working for you for your goals. And that doesn't mean that you have to say, well, $50,000 would work for me better, kind of statement. But it's a check-in more than anything else. Am I on track? Do I have the clinical productivity that you expect me to have? Do I have the research productivity you expect me to have? Or do I have more? In which case, maybe we should think about protecting a little more time or increasing the research salary a little bit. And it's not a renegotiation, capital R, capital N. It's a check-in and a tweaking, I think. It's worth thinking about every year.
Okay, well, maybe I misunderstood what the original question was, but I absolutely demand that in my department, and so and actually it was when I was at the University of Florida, we actually had an annual faculty report that you filled out and turned in. And then the idea was that you'd have a meeting with your division chief once a year after you turned it in to talk again exactly that, your yearly check-in. And so that actually wasn't being done at Buffalo when I came here, and I started that. So, we actually have a form. We've actually had many iterations of it over time. It's now going online. So we've put together a whole online thing. And it's actually at the school level. It's gone beyond the department. But it's a way of upload. You can put in your achievements. It allows us to create reports if we need to very quickly about how much research funding there is or how much education people are doing and how much clinical activity they're doing. And then the way we structure it is those faculty members meet with their division chief. So it's a minimum once a year, but for younger faculty, I think more frequent check-ins are a good idea. And it is about, are you on track? Are you, because one of the worst, when I first got to Buffalo, one of the first faculty showed up in my office had been on the faculty for 10 years, still an assistant professor. She came into my office, she says, I want to get promoted. And I said, okay, let me see your CV. And she had no publications. Now, how does somebody get on the faculty for 10 years and they've never had that discussion? So, I told her what she needed to do. I mean, she's actually going to be an associate professor this year. So she got very heavily involved in quality improvement and published it. So, but there wasn't any of that kind of check-in with anybody. And so, yes, absolutely. And if you're not getting it, if it's not a routine where you are, then ask for it. I mean, you have every right to come in and sit down, here's my CV, this is what I've been doing, how am I doing? And I look at it, I think the major goal, it's not compensation or not, it's about, is your career trajectory working for you and getting you where you want to go? And what I get most excited, I mean, the people you're going to hang on to the most at any university are the ones who are excited about what they're doing. They've got goals and they're pursuing them. And for some people, that's getting involved in hospital administration. Other people, it's extramural grant funding. Other people, I've got people who are passionate, really passionate about education, who have taken on roles in the system. You have to help your faculty figure out what it is that really gets them fired up and help them move in that direction.
The message is that the negotiation is constantly.
Yeah.
And if your chief doesn't know what value you bring and you don't know what he or she wants you to do, it's hard to have a substantive discussion and come to agreement.
Sure.
So we've got Anne, I want to make an editorial comment. Probably we understand why they recruited you if that faculty member hadn't been reviewed in 10 years. So, so there was a question, and maybe Tracy, I know you've been putting stuff in the chat box, and I know your video doesn't work, but what's the difference between a mentor and a sponsor? Somebody asked back a while ago.
I think it was answered. A sponsor opens a door. I think Roseanne answered this one. Sponsor is someone that you use is not the right word, but you ask very kindly to help you open doors, and who was willing to do that. A mentor needs to be more than that. They have to have your best interests at heart and are transparent with that and guide you along the path that you want to be guided along. So I think it's that's sort of the key difference. Remember yesterday I talked about someone sitting in my office with a list of 12 people that they wanted to meet and wanted to know if I knew them. They were asking for me to sponsor them. But the person who was really asking me to mentor is someone who basically said, sat down, had a conversation with me about what they want to do and talked about their plans. That's someone I'm mentoring.
Yeah, that's good. I will say that I think I want to bring up what Pam has said for years. I don't know if you invented this, Pam, or if you just propagated it, but the term mosaic mentoring, that you can't have you don't necessarily have a mentor for your, work-life balance might not be the same person as who's mentoring your science career. So that doesn't mean you can't have more than one mentor. And I'll just tell story about, I think those of you who were on the networking event last night, I talked about changing from doing research in flow and metabolism with PET to shifting to heart failure early in my career. And Marielle Jessup, who's a very dear friend of mine now, started out as a sponsor of mine. And she is an amazing sponsor for those of you in heart failure who know her, and even outside of heart failure. There wasn't a single person at any meeting that she didn't make sure she would stop, look at the person, tell the person who I was and where I was and what I was doing. Then the conversation would go on. That's what a sponsor does in person, or picks up the phone or sends the email. And that's really good. She's an outstanding sponsor, and there are many others. But Tracy, I like your those two examples are a great distinguisher. What else? Contracting.
Fatima had a great comment that I want to make sure everyone saw, which is a key part to promotion is external validation of your stature within the field. And this is one of the hardest hurdles to overcome in an academic institution. Somehow, every step of a lot of institutions, I don't know if this is all institutions, but a lot of institutions at every step of promotion ask you for anywhere between 8 to 15 names of people who know of you, but who's never written with you before, published with you, has never had in writing, on paper connections with you before. That is one of the hardest exercises to do, and really speaks to the importance of networking, and also speaks to it gives you a good reason for why you should volunteer for some things within your the available time that you have, because these are the people who are going to have to write a letter of support in a more than lukewarm fashion if you want to be if you want to be promoted. So thanks, Fatima, for bringing that up.
I will say on that topic, and maybe Pam, you could comment as well. As a past ACC, I sometimes get requests to do that for people who I've never seen, don't know, I'm not in their field. And so be careful when you're identifying these people. They have to actually, you don't have to know them, but you got to at least be aware of their scientific endeavors, because it's really crucial who you pick. Yeah,
I've you know, I sometimes kid that every woman, female electrophysiologist in the United States asks me to write a letter for them.
And I write the other letter. You know, I'm happy to. I get a lot of requests to write letters like that, and there are times when I don't know the person at all. You know, and if I don't, I mean, I usually just feel like it's a good citizen thing. I've got, you know, I write letters, and sometimes it's meant to, you know, I'll say I'm basing it on their CV. Which is not as good a recommendation as if you know somebody personally, but I'll provide it if that's what they're looking for. So, you know, I do think a very comical one I got within the past year was I was asked to write. It was not a woman. It was I can't remember where the person was from, but they said, we're not going to show you the person's CV because we want you to give a letter that's completely unbiased. And I said, I don't know who this is. I had no idea who the person was. I didn't have a CV, and I wasn't going to start researching him to figure it out. So I actually turned that one down. That was the oddest request I've ever seen. Generally speaking, you'll see a CV. And the thing is that, though, you know, even if I don't know somebody personally, you can look through a CV and you can say, oh, boy, they were on that guideline writing committee. They've done a lot of editorial boards. You know, you can see the sorts of things that would, because what I can say that other people don't necessarily say is, you know, what are the best cardiology journals? Which ones, you know, really mean more if you get published here versus there, or maybe some grant funding and things like that. So, you know, I think it, you know, I've never heard of anybody asking for 8 to 15 letters. That must, you know, a lot of people don't do it, or they won't do it on time, which is why people get desperate and ask for so many names. You know, in most places, you know, I'd say several outside letters are necessary. And they become, you know, even more necessary at the professor level and the associate professor. So networking, though, is an incredibly important way of getting people, you know, that can write your letters. Yeah, so we require 10 names or close to 10 names at every level. And
internal only? I mean, external only, or internal and external?
All external.
External.
Really?
All external.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And none of them can be anybody that you have ever published with. So don't rely necessarily, unless your institution is forgiving about it, don't rely on your collaborators to write those letters necessarily. You nearly need arm's length people.
Well, it could be somebody who heard you speak at a meeting, right? Because that's not necessarily going to pop up. You know, you've been on clinical trials together, maybe, but you know, as long as you're right, you know, the publications. I think that's to me that's a little silly, because sometimes what happens, it's you know, you got 20 names on a paper, and neither one of you was the first author on it. I don't know, you know, I think some universities have taken that to an extreme, but you know, you've got to follow whatever the rules they have.
Yeah. I mean, they ask for 10 because they don't get 10. They get a much smaller number.
Yeah, that's, I said, a lot of them turn things down.
Yeah, people that you work with through professional societies or through journal work, who you're not publishing with, are ideal folks to meet. You know, whoever you figure out as your accountability buddy here from this group over the next year, that's a great person to ask for a letter when the time comes. So, you know, keep that in the back of your mind and make connections. You have to work harder in this virtual era than you used to. But also make sure you introduce yourself to people. If you're speaking I mean, I'm sure somebody several people on this are speaking at AHA coming up. Introduce yourself to the moderators in advance by email.
Well,
and tape sessions.
I mean, obviously, I did a lot in the Heart Rhythm Society, and early on in my career, I happened to be on a program at a local Sarasota Memorial Hospital. I was speaking at a weekend CME program, and one of the people speaking was a guy named Jim Maloney, who at the time was the president of the Heart Rhythm Society. I gave my lecture on syncope. I can still remember that. I went up to him afterwards. I introduced myself, and I said, I'd love to do something for the Heart Rhythm Society. He put me on a committee, and that's where everything started. So, I did exactly that. I went right up to him and did it the following year, too.
So Tracy, you're commenting on the editorial boards and whether Tracy's recommending that you do get on editorial boards, but I think the specific question was, how does that figure into promotion and other?
I'm distracted by Roseanne's guests, so hi. Editorial boards are great. Usually you get invited. It's really an honorary type of position. And usually they find out about you through work you've done, for lectures you've done, and because they've asked you to review before, they've tested you out and you've done a really good job. So it's a combination of all of those things. The amount of work does vary from journal to journal, but generally editorial boards are not small, so the work is spread out. And it's a great way to see, some of the behind the curtain type of activities that are going on in journal. And like the same thing as I said with grant review, it's always great. You get good insights from being on the other side. Editor positions, and I'd love to hear from others who are in editor positions. I took on an editor position about a year ago at GEM, and I love it. But it is a huge amount of work. So I read something like 25 papers a week, which is, on top of my day job. There is usually there might be, not all, some compensation for it, but the compensation is nominal. It's really just that. So with editor's position, I would say that I would probably get into it if you, A, have a passion for this kind of work, and B, perhaps a little later in your career rather than earlier in your career, just because it could be a pretty large time commitment here, for something that is really more of a service type of role rather than necessarily a career climbing type of role.
I want to comment on that, if I can. I don't want to push on anyone, but I serve as the associate editor for JAMA Cardiology, and I would say it's probably one of the best opportunities and the best job I love the most, and I look forward to it the most, especially because everyone else is so much smarter than me on that editorial board with Stefano and Clyde Yancey and Pat O'Gara and just the creme de la creme of cardiology. And I learn so much every week by being on there, and then going through the consultations and seeing how they look and review papers. And it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone because it's general cardiology, and it's, I'm learning about heart failure and EP and all of these other areas. So I actually believe that it is a very, very important stepping stone in my career. I learn a lot, but I agree with Tracy hugely in that it's a huge amount of time. I literally spend about 9 to 10 hours solid a week on looking at not just the papers that are in my bucket, but also helping with looking at all the other papers that are that my colleagues are reviewing and giving my opinion on those because they request them, and it helps to come to a final decision. That's the reason why you're there. But I think early, and I do believe that this is something you do a little bit later in your career, but early in your career, I think I can tell you that we at JAMA Cardiology are looking for people who want to review articles. And what we do is we usually ask for more reviewers than what we need for our papers, because, and having some of the young unknown people who will then come in and do a great review is a way that you will then be recognized and say, wow, you know, this doctor did a great job. This was an amazing review. And you can get, if you do a really, really good review on a controversial topic, it doesn't matter if you're young, old, or whatever, you might be asked to write an editorial just based on that, on your great review. And we've done that a lot. And then, of course, if you do that over and over again, you respond and you do a great job and you do it in a timely fashion, we need more reviewers than we can get our hands on, because many people are just way too busy to do good reviews. And if you do a great review and it comes back, you're asked again and again, you will then get on that editorial board if that's what you're looking for. And I do think it helps you in your institution. Anne is the chief of medicine. Isn't that great for you if your faculty is on an editorial board? I'm sure you would want that. You believe that that's an important thing, don't you?
Yeah, yeah. Although I'd like to just maybe clarify a little bit, if assuming we're saying the same thing. I look at it almost as there's three different areas you're talking about. One is reviewing a manuscript for a journal. And I do think getting those opportunities and being able to put it on your CV, that's the beginnings of some national recognition, right? Somebody recognized your name enough to say, would you review this? The next step would be editorial board. Yeah, generally speaking, you'll get on the editorial board because you've done reviews and you've done them on time and you've done them well. I mean, you know, if you do a bunch of them, you'll get that. There can be a large number of people on an editorial board. I'm not sure if JAMA Cardiology is like this, but most of the editorial boards I'm on, when I'm just a member of the editorial board, we have a meeting once a year where they go over things, and the number of manuscripts I get asked to review vary wildly. There are some editorial boards I'm on that I hardly ever get asked to write a review on, and then there are other ones that if I sent it in at 3 o'clock, they're asking me at 4 o'clock for another one. It's too much, you know. Right. So that's the editorial board. Then there's being like associate editor, so they're getting one step beyond that. So I'm an associate editor for Jack now, and so that's a lot of work. So I'm on, I have 4 o'clock today. It's going to go from, it's going to be 2 or 2.5 hours this afternoon. It's every Tuesday afternoon. I handled 2 manuscripts this morning. I have to handle, 4 to 8 a week, and they take a varying amount of time depending on what's going on. That's a big commitment that I do get paid for. But as everybody says, you're not doing this for the money, because it's more hours than that's worth. You're not going to get asked to be an associate editor of a journal early in a career. So I wouldn't hesitate to get on an editorial board, because I think that's a nice plum to have. And again, like I said, if you get on the editorial board for Circulation or Jack, you're probably going to get asked a lot. Some of the more minor journals, it just doesn't come up as often, and so that can be a good thing. I was on the editorial board for one of the Circulation journals, and they were asking me so many times. I actually just realized I just recently stepped down from it. If you're on the editorial board, you can't be saying no all the time or ignoring requests for reviewing, because otherwise they don't want you. They'll take you off.
I agree exactly with what you say, Anne. I'm an associate editor for Circulation, and it's a ton of work. There are 3-hour meetings every week, so many papers. But there are a lot of ways. I agree completely. Start doing reviews, do great reviews, and you will get invited back. And every journal has a social media editor, and they are people who actually just push out content, and they often get invited to sit in on editorial board meetings, and you get to learn so much. And I was going to say this earlier. The things I've learned the most from in my career was being a member of an IRB, and it was so much work and so much time, but I learned so well about what they're looking for in their applications, et cetera. being on study sections, it's so much work and it's so much time, but you learn what they're looking for. And I can't tell you how valuable that is. And being on editorial boards.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up here because I have we only have 5 more minutes in our time together, and I wanted to kind of wrap up with what our next steps are. So, Jacob, do you have the last few slides that we have? Please go to the member hub and ask some of the questions that you just put in the chat box. So it's truly up to you what can happen when you leave this particular meeting. We're gonna be sending 2 different surveys out to you. One is, how did this meeting go for you? That's going to be one survey, and we want to know your frank opinions. Do not sugarcoat it. If you didn't like something, let us know. If you want more time for something, let us know. And we need feedback for our next sessions. We're going to meet on Thursday, Tracy, Pam, Stephanie, and I, to talk about what we're going to plan for April. And so please send us your ideas. We do think April will likely be virtual. I saw Wakasa's comment that his WebEx keeps crashing. Zoom is lighter on the computer. Okay. This is the platform that the college uses, so we'll talk about whether Zoom would be okay. But we do think it'll be likely that it'll be virtual, and then hopefully in person in October. So how to execute on your career plan, determine your own method of accountability, yourself, a mentor, colleague, maybe somebody here to be your buddy to help you be accountable. Then assess your own progress with the mentor or yourself and celebrate successes. On the member hub, that's a private group. You will see all the session slides, some articles we've posted, and the upcoming webinars. We will have webinars between now and the April meeting. We did invite the speakers who are cardiologists to be on the member hub. That's Megan Coley-Wright, and help me out, guys, the ones who weren't on the planning committee. So they'll be on that member hub as well. And so this is your network to use as you wish. If you haven't been on the member hub, once you sign up and you join a group, you will get an email if somebody posts it. So you'll be able to kind of keep up to date with what people are saying. Jacob, can I have the next slide? So before the April sessions, we recommend that you connect with 2 CTR learners for virtual coffee, and you can reach out using, I think we wanted to say the member hub there. And lastly, the CTR follow-up survey. Now that Stephanie's going to send out right away, maybe today or tomorrow, your evaluation of this particular meeting, but then the follow-up survey is coming, and that's about your progress.
I think Stephanie's got the evaluation form already. She said she was sending it at 1:50 p.m. So it should be in your inbox. Please do that. Do that evaluation. And in there, it's mostly just sort of more direct feedback about the last 2 days. And it's while the topic's fresh in your mind and you've got written notes about what else you wish you could have heard about, put that in there, because we are going to use that information to figure out when the WebExos are going to happen, how they're going to happen, who to invite, what should it be about. And we're already going to start planning. We've already started planning, but we're getting ready to tailor the next 2-day meeting for this group. So we need those ideas. Please, please, please put those in. There's a follow-up survey that's coming along that's more gauging you and how you progressed through the year. And these will be surveys we're going to do intermittently. And this is really to examine the effectiveness of the program for folks. And so that'll be coming shortly.
And I think we have one more slide, maybe. Can't remember. Yeah, there we go. So module 2 will be April 12th and 13th, and the third one, October 2021. Hopefully that one will be at Hart House. I already mentioned the webinars. Lastly, I want to remind all of you that this was a competitive process and you were chosen for this program, and make sure that you put this on your CV. So don't miss that step. Pam, Tracy, do you want to add anything else?
Nothing for me other than thank you to all of our faculty, to the steering committee, and to all of you in the audience for being amazing audience, very engaged, very with the program, and we really look forward to working with all of you over the next year. So please prioritize this program in your busy lives. The more you do that, the more you will get out of the program.
Yeah, I'll add my thanks to the faculty and the steering committee. It was a lot of work. Some people had to pre-record and do other things and struggle with the virtual environment. So very valuable, and appreciate everybody's contribution, including all the learners.
And last but not least at all, Stephanie Mitchell, who did an amazing job organizing everything. Yeah.
Bravo. Thank you, Stephanie. All right, everyone, we'll see you on the Member Hub, and look forward to April.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was great.